Chapter 15 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 15, consisting of Arrival at Port Denison, Queensland. A lecture. Reminiscences of Captain Cook. Lecturing for charity at Cooktown. A happy escape from a coral sea. Home Island, Sunday Island, Bird Island. An American pearl fisherman. Jubilee at Thursday Island. A new ensign for the Spray. Booby Island. Across the Indian Ocean. Christmas Island. On the morning of the 26th, Gloucester Island was close aboard, and the Spray anchored in the evening at Port Denison, where rests, on a hill, the sweet little town of Bowen, the future watering place and health resort of Queensland. The country all about here has a healthful appearance. The harbour was easy of approach, spacious and safe, and afforded excellent holding ground. It was quiet in Bowen when the Spray arrived, and the good people, with an hour to throw away on the second evening of her arrival, came down to the School of Arts to talk about the voyage, it being the latest event. It was duly advertised in the two little papers, Boomerang and Nully Nully, in the one the day before the affair came off, and in the other the day after, which was all the same to the editor, and for that matter it was the same to me. Besides this, circulars were distributed with a flourish, and the best bellman in Australia was employed. But I could have keel-hauled the wretch, bell and all, when he came to the door of the little hotel where my prospective audience and I were dining, and with his clattering bell and fiendish yell made noises that would awaken the dead. All over the voyage of the Spray, from Boston to Bowen, the two hubs in the cartwheels of creation, as the Boomerang afterwards said. Mr. Miles, magistrate, harbour-master, land commissioner, gold warden, etc., was chairman, and introduced me, for what reason I never knew, except to embarrass me with a scene of vain ostentation and embitter my life, for heaven knows I had met every person in town the first hour ashore. I knew them all by name now, and they all knew me. However, Mr. Miles was a good talker. Indeed, I tried to induce him to go on and tell the story while I showed the pictures, but this he refused to do. I may explain that it was a talk illustrated by stereopticon. The views were good, but the lantern, a 30-shilling affair, was wretched, and had only an oil lamp in it. I sailed early the next morning, before the papers came out, thinking it best to do so. They each appeared with a favourable column, however, of what they called a lecture, so I learnt afterwards, and they had a kind word for the bellman besides. From Port Denison the sloop ran before the constant trade wind, and made no stop at all, night or day, until she reached Cooktown on the Endeavour River, where she arrived Monday, May 31, 1897, before a furious blast of wind encountered that day 50 miles down the coast. On this parallel of latitude is the high ridge and backbone of the trade winds, which about Cooktown amount often to a hard gale. I had been charged to navigate the route with extra care, and to feel my way over the ground. The skilled officer of the Royal Navy, who advised me to take the Barrier Reef passage, wrote me that HMS Orlando steamed nights as well as days through it, but that I, under sail, would jeopardize my vessel on coral reefs if I undertook to do so. Confidentially, it would have been no easy matter finding anchorage every night. The hard work, too, of getting the sloop under way every morning was finished, I had hoped, when she cleared the Strait of Magellan. Besides that, the best of Admiralty charts made it possible to keep on sailing night and day. Indeed, with a fair wind, and in the clear weather of that season, the way through the Barrier Reef Channel, in all sincerity, was clearer than a highway in a busy city, and by all odds less dangerous. But to anyone contemplating the voyage, I should say, beware of reefs day or night, or, remaining on the land, be wary still. "The Spray came flying into port like a bird," said the longshore daily papers of Cooktown the morning after she arrived, "and it seems strange," they added, "that only one man could be seen on board working the craft." The Spray was doing her best, to be sure, for it was near night, and she was in haste to find a perch before dark. Tacking inside of all the craft in port, I moored her at sunset nearly abreast the Captain Cook monument, and next morning went ashore to feast my eyes upon the very stones the great navigator had seen, for I was now on a seaman's consecrated ground. But there seemed a question in Cooktown's mind as to the exact spot where his ship, the Endeavour, hove down for repairs on her memorable voyage round the world. Some said it was not at all at the place where the monument now stood. A discussion of the subject was going on one morning where I happened to be, and a young lady present, turning to me as one of some authority in nautical matters, very flatteringly asked my opinion. Well, I could see no reason why Captain Cook, if he made up his mind to repair his ship inland, couldn't have dredged out a channel to the place where the monument now stood, if he had a dredging machine with him, and afterwards fill it up again. For Captain Cook could do most anything, and nobody ever said that he hadn't a dredger along. The young lady seemed to lean to my way of thinking, and, following up the story of the historical voyage, asked if I had visited the point further down the harbour where the great circumnavigator was murdered. This took my breath, but a bright schoolboy coming along relieved my embarrassment, for, like all boys, seeing that information was wanted, he volunteered to supply it. Said he, "Captain Cook wasn't murdered here at all, ma'am. He was killed in Africa. A lion het him." Here I was reminded of distressful days gone by. I think it was in 1866 that the old steamship Souchez, from Batavia for Sydney, put in at Cooktown for scurvy grass, as I always thought, and, incidentally, to land mails. On her sick list was my fevered self, and so I didn't see the place till I came back on the Spray 31 years later. And now I saw coming into port the physical wrecks of miners from New Guinea, destitute and dying. Many had died on the way and had been buried at sea. He would have been a hardened wretch who could look on and not try to do something for them. The sympathy of all went out to these sufferers, but the little town was already straitened from a long run on its benevolence. I thought of the matter of the lady's gift to me at Tasmania, which I had promised myself I would keep only as a loan, but found now to my embarrassment that I had invested the money. However, the good Cooktown people wished to hear a story of the sea, and how the crew of the Spray fared when illness got aboard of her. Accordingly, the little Presbyterian church on the hill was opened for a congregation. Everybody talked, and they made a roaring success of it. Judge Chester, the magistrate, was at the head of the game, and so it was bound to succeed. He it was who annexed the island of New Guinea to Great Britain. "While I was about it," said he, "I annexed the bloomin' lot of it." There was a ring in the statement pleasant to the ear of an old voyager. However, the Germans made such a row over the judge's mainsail haul that they got a share in the venture. Well, I was now indebted to the miners of Cooktown for the great privilege of adding a mite to the worthy cause, and to Judge Chester all the town was indebted for a general good time. The matter standing so, I sailed on June 6, 1897, heading away for the north as before. Arrived at a very inviting anchorage about sundown the 7th, I came to for the night abreast the Claremont lightship. This was the only time throughout the passage of the Barrier Reef Channel that the Spray anchored, except at Fort Denison and at Endeavour River. On the very night following this, however, the 8th, I regretted keenly for an instant that I had not anchored before dark, as I might have done easily under the lee of a coral reef. It happened in this way. The Spray had just passed M Reef lightship, and left the light dipping astern when, going at full speed with sheets off, she hit the M Reef itself on the north end, where I expected to see a beacon. She swung off quickly on her heel, however, and with one more bound on a swell, cut across the shoal point so quickly that I hardly knew how it was done. The beacon wasn't there. At least, I didn't see it. I hadn't time to look for it after she struck, and certainly it didn't much matter then whether I saw it or not. But this gave her a fine departure for Cape Greenville, the next point ahead. I saw the ugly boulders under the sloop's keel as she flashed over them, and I made a mental note of it that the letter M, for which the reef was named, was the 13th one in our alphabet, and that 13, as noted years before, was still my lucky number. The natives of Cape Greenville are notoriously bad, and I was advised to give them the go-by. Accordingly, from M Reef, I steered outside of the adjacent islands to be on the safe side. Skipping along now, the Spray passed Home Island off the pitch of the Cape soon after midnight, and squared away on a westerly course. A short time later she fell in with a steamer bound south, groping her way in the dark, and making the night dismal with her own black smoke. From Home Island I made for Sunday Island, and bringing that abeam, shortened sail, not wishing to make Bird Island further along before daylight, the wind being still fresh, and the islands being low, with dangers about them. Wednesday, June 9, 1897, at daylight, Bird Island was dead ahead, distant 2.5 miles, which I considered near enough. A strong current was pressing the sloop forward. I did not shorten sail too soon in the night. The first and only Australian canoe seen on the voyage was encountered here, standing from the mainland, with a rag of sail set, bound for this island. A long, slim fish that leapt on board in the night was found on deck this morning. I had it for breakfast. The spry chap was no larger than a herring, which it represented in every respect, except that it was 3 times as long. But that was so much the better, for I am rather fond of fresh herring anyway. A great number of fisher birds were about this day, which was one of the pleasantest on God's earth. The Spray, dancing over the waves, entered Albany Pass as the sun drew low in the west over the hills of Australia. At 7:30 p.m, the Spray, now through the pass, came to anchor in a cove in the mainland near a pearl fisherman called the Tarawa, which was at anchor, her captain from the deck of his vessel directing me to a berth. This done, he at once came on board to clasp hands. The Tarawa was a Californian, and Captain Jones, her master, was an American. On the following morning, Captain Jones brought on board 2 pairs of exquisite pearl shells, the most perfect ones I ever saw. They were probably the best he had, for Jones was the heart-yarn of a sailor. He assured me that if I would remain a few hours longer, some friends from Somerset nearby would pay us all a visit, and one of the crew sorting shells on deck guessed they would. The mate guessed so too. The friends came, as even the second mate and cook had guessed they would. They were Mr. Jardine, stockman, famous throughout the land, and his family. Mrs. Jardine was the niece of King Malietoa, and cousin to the beautiful Famusami, to make the sea burn, who visited the Spray at Apia. Mr. Jardine was himself a fine specimen of a Scotsman. With his little family about him, he was content to live in this remote place, accumulating the comforts of life. The fact of the Tararua having been built in America accounted for the crew, Boy Jim and all, being such good guessers. Strangely enough, though, Captain Jones himself, the only American aboard, was never heard to guess at all. After a pleasant chat and goodbye to the people of the Tararua and to Mr. and Mrs. Jardine, I again weighed anchor and stood across for Thursday Island, now in plain view, mid-channel in Torres Strait, where I arrived shortly after noon. Here the Spray remained over until June 24. Being the only American representative in port, this tarry was imperative, for on the 22nd was the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. The 2 days over were, as sailors say, for coming up. Meanwhile, I spent pleasant days about the island. Mr. Douglas, resident magistrate, invited me on a cruise in his steamer one day among the islands in Torres Strait. This being a scientific expedition in charge of Professor Mason Bailey, botanist, we rambled over Friday and Saturday Islands, where I got a glimpse of botany. Miss Bailey, the Professor's daughter, accompanied the expedition, and told me of many indigenous plants, with long names. The 22nd was a great day on Thursday Island, for then we had not only the Jubilee, but a Jubilee with a grand corroboree in it. Mr. Douglas, having brought some 400 native warriors and their wives and children across from the mainland to give the celebration the true native touch, for when they do a thing on Thursday Island, they do it with a roar. The corroboree was, at any rate, a howling success. It took place at night, and the performers, painted in fantastic colours, danced or leapt about before a blazing fire. Some were rigged and painted like birds and beasts, in which the emu and kangaroo were well represented. One fellow leapt like a frog. Some had the human skeleton painted on their bodies, while they jumped about threateningly, spear in hand, ready to strike down some imaginary enemy. The kangaroo hopped and danced with natural ease and grace, making a fine figure. All kept time to music, vocal and instrumental, the instruments, save the mark, being bits of wood, which they beat one against the other, and saucer-like bones held in the palms of the hands, which they knocked together, making a dull sound. It was a show at once amusing, spectacular, and hideous. The warrior aborigines that I saw in Queensland were for the most part lithe and fairly well built, but they were stamped always with repulsive features, and their women were, if possible, still more ill-favoured. I observed that on the day of the Jubilee no foreign flag was waving in the public grounds except the Stars and Stripes, which along with the Union Jack guarded the gateway, and floated in many places, from the tiniest to the standard size. Speaking to Mr. Douglas, I ventured a remark on this compliment to my country. "Oh," said he, "this is a family affair, and we do not consider the Stars and Stripes a foreign flag." The Spray, of course, flew her best bunting, and hoisted the Jack, as well as her own noble flag, as high as she could. On June 24, the Spray, well fitted in every way, sailed for the long voyage ahead down the Indian Ocean. Mr. Douglas gave her a flag as she was leaving his island. The Spray had now passed nearly all the dangers of the Coral Sea and Torres Strait, which indeed were not a few, and all ahead from this point was plain sailing and a straight course. The trade wind was still blowing fresh, and could be safely counted on now down to the coast of Madagascar, if not beyond that, for it was still early in the season. I had no wish to arrive off the Cape of Good Hope before midsummer, and it was now early winter. I had been off that cape once in July, which was, of course, midwinter there. The stout ship I then commanded encountered only fierce hurricanes, and she bore them ill. I wished for no winter gales now, It was not that I feared them more, being in the Spray, instead of a large ship, but that I preferred fine weather in any case. It is true that one may encounter heavy gales off the Cape of Good Hope at any season of the year, but in the summer they are less frequent, and do not continue so long. And so, with time enough before me to admit of a run ashore on the islands en route, I shaped the course now for Keeling Cocos, Atoll Islands, distance 2,700 miles. Taking a departure now from Booby Island, which the sloop passed early in the day, I decided to sight Timor on the way, an island of great mountains. Booby Island I had seen before, but only once, however, and that was when in the steamship Souchez, on which I was hove down in a fever. When she steamed along this way, I was well enough to crawl on deck to look at Booby Island. Had I died for it, I would have seen that island. In those days, passing ships landed stores in a cave on the island for shipwrecked and distressed wayfarers. Captain Airy of the Souchez, a good man, sent a boat to the cave with his contribution to the general store. The stores were landed in safety, and the boat returning brought back from the impoverished post office there a dozen or more letters, most of them left by whalemen, with the request that the first homeward-bound ship would carry them along and see to their mailing, which had been the custom of this strange postal service for many years. Some of the letters brought back by our boat were directed to New Bedford, and some to Fairhaven, Massachusetts. There is a light today on Booby Island, and regular packet communication with the rest of the world, and the beautiful uncertainty of the fate of letters left there is a thing of the past. I made no call at the little island, but standing close in, exchanged signals with the keeper of the light. Sailing on, the sloop was at once in the Arafura Sea, where for days she sailed in water milky white and green and purple. It was my good fortune to enter the sea on the last quarter of the moon, the advantage being that in the dark nights I witnessed the phosphorescent light effect at night in its greatest splendour. The sea, where the sloop disturbed it, seemed all ablaze, so that by its light I could see the smallest articles on deck, and her wake was a path of fire. On the 25th of June, the sloop was already clear of all the shoals and dangers, and was sailing on a smooth sea as steadily as before, but with speed somewhat slackened. I got out the flying jib made at Juan Fernandez, and set it as a spinnaker from the stoutest bamboo that Mrs. Stevenson had given me at Samoa. The spinnaker pulled like a sodger, and the bamboo holding its own, the Spray mended her pace. Several pigeons flying across today from Australia towards the islands bent their course over the Spray. Smaller birds were seen flying in the opposite direction. In the part of the Afura that I came to first, where it was shallow, sea snakes writhed about on the surface and tumbled over and over in the waves. As the sloop sailed further on, where the sea became deep, they disappeared. In the ocean, where the water is blue, not one was ever seen. In the days of serene weather there was not much to do but to read and take rest on the Spray, to make up as much as possible for the rough time off Cape Horn, which was not yet forgotten, and to forestall the Cape of Good Hope by a store of ease. My sea journal was now much the same from day to day. Something like this of June 26 and 27, for example. June 26, in the morning. It is a bit squally. Later in the day, blowing a steady breeze. On the log at noon is 130 miles. Subtract correction for slip, 10 miles. Total, 120 miles. Add correction for current, 10 miles. Total, 130 miles. Latitude, by observation at noon, 10 degrees 23 minutes south. Longitude, as per mark on the chart. Now there wasn't much brainwork in that log, I'm sure. June 27 makes a better showing when all is told. First of all today was a flying fish on deck. Fried it in butter. 133 miles on the log. For slip, off, and for current, on, as per guess. About equal. Let it go at that. Latitude by observation at noon, 10 degrees, 25 minutes south. For several days now the Spray sailed west on the parallel of 10 degrees, 25 minutes south, as true as a hair. If she deviated at all from that through the day or night, and this may have happened, she was back, strangely enough, at noon at the same latitude. But the greatest science was in reckoning the longitude. My tin clock and only timepiece had by this time lost its minute hand, but after I boiled her she told the hours, and that was near enough on a long stretch. On the 22nd of June the great island of Timor was in view away to the nor'ard. On the following day I saw Dana Island, not far off, and a breeze came up from the land at night, fragrant of the spices or what not of the coast. On the 11th, with all sail set and with the spinnaker still aboard, Christmas Island, about noon, came into view, one point on the starboard bow. Before night it was abeam and distant 2.5 miles. The surface of the island appeared evenly rounded from the sea to a considerable height in the centre. In outline it was as smooth as a fish, and a long ocean swell, rolling up, broke against the sides, where it lay like a monster asleep, motionless on the sea. It seemed to have the proportions of a whale, and as the sloop sailed along its side to the part where the head would be, there was a nostril even, which was a blow-hole through a ledge of rock, where every wave that dashed threw up a shaft of water, lifelike and real. It had been a long time since I last saw this island, but I remember my temporary admiration for the captain of the ship I was then in, the Tanjore, when he sang out one morning from the quarter-deck, well aft, "Go aloft there, one of ye, with a pair of eyes, and see Christmas Island." Sure enough, there the island was, in sight from the Royal Yard. Captain M. had thus made a great hit, and he never got over it. The chief mate, terror of us ordinaries in the ship, walking never to windward of the captain, now took himself very humbly to leeward altogether. When we arrived at Hong Kong there was a letter in the ship's mail for me. I was in the boat with the captain some hours while he had it. But do you suppose he could hand a letter to a seaman? No, indeed, not even to an ordinary seaman. When we got to the ship, he gave it to the first mate. The first mate gave it to the second mate, and he laid it, minchingly, on the capstan head, where I could get it. End of chapter 15. Read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. Chapter 16 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 16, consisting of a call for careful navigation, 3 hours steering in 23 days, arrival at the Keeling Cocos Islands, a curious chapter of social history, a welcome from the children of the islands, cleaning and painting the spray on the beach, a Mohammedan blessing for a pot of jam, Keeling as a paradise, a risky adventure in a small boat, away to Rodriguez, taken for Antichrist. The governor calms the fears of the people. A lecture. A convent in the hills. To the Keeling Cocos Islands was now only 550 miles, but even in this short run it was necessary to be extremely careful in keeping a true course, else I would miss the atoll. On the 12th, some 100 miles southwest of Christmas Island, I saw anti-cloud trades flying up from the southwest, very high over the regular winds, which weakened now for a few days, while a swell, heavier than usual, set in also from the southwest. A winter gale was going on in the direction of the Cape of Good Hope. Accordingly, I steered higher to windward, allowing 20 miles a day while this went on for change of current. And it was not too much, for on that course I made the Keeling Islands right ahead. The first unmistakable sign of the land was a visit one morning from a white tern that fluttered very knowingly about the vessel, and then took itself off westward with a business-like air in its wings. The tern is called by the islanders the pilot of Keeling Cocos. Farther on I came among a large number of birds, fishing and fighting over whatever they caught. My reckoning was up, and springing aloft I saw from halfway up the mast coconut trees standing out of the water ahead. I expected to see this. Still, it thrilled me as an electric shock might have done. I slid down the mast, trembling under the strangest sensations, and not being able to resist the impulse, I sat on deck and gave way to my emotions. To folks in a parlour on shore, this may seem weak indeed, but I am telling the story of a voyage alone. I didn't touch the helm, for with the current and heave of the sea the sloop found herself at the end of the run absolutely in the fairway of the channel. You couldn't have beaten it in the Navy. Then I trimmed her sails by the wind, took the helm, and flogged her up the couple of miles or so abreast the harbour landing, where I cast anchor at 3:30 p.m., July 17, 1897, 23 days from Thursday Island. The distance run was 2,700 miles as the crow flies. This would have been a fair Atlantic voyage. It was a delightful sail. During those 23 days I had not spent altogether more than 3 hours at the helm, including the time occupied in beating into Keeling Harbour. I just lashed the helm and let her go. Whether the wind was abeam or dead aft, it was all the same. She always sailed on her course. No part of the voyage up to this point, taking it by and large, had been so finished as this. Footnote. Mr. Andrew J. Leach, reporting July 21st, 1897, through Governor Kinnersley of Singapore to Joseph Chamberlain, Colonial Secretary, said concerning the Iphigenia's visit to the atoll, "As we left the ocean depths of deepest blue and entered the coral circle, the contrast was most remarkable. The brilliant colours of the water, transparent to a depth of over 30 feet, now purple, now of the deepest sky blue, and now green with the white crests of the waves flashing under a brilliant sun. The encircling palm-clad islands, the gaps between them which were to the south undiscernible, the white sand shores and the whiter gaps where breakers appeared, and lastly the lagoon itself, 7 or 8 miles across from north to south, and 5 to 6 from east to west, presented a sight never to be forgotten. After some little delay, Mr. Sidney Ross, the elder son of Mr. George Ross, came off to meet us, and soon after, accompanied by the doctor and another officer, we went ashore." Footnote continues. On reaching the landing stage, we found hauled up for cleaning, etc., the Spray of Boston, a yawl of 12.7 tons gross, the property of Captain Joshua Slocum. He arrived at the island on the 17th of July, 23 days out from Thursday Island. This extraordinary solitary traveller left Boston some 2 years ago, single-handed, crossed to Gibraltar, sailed down to Cape Horn, passed through the Strait of Magellan to the Society Islands, thence to Australia and through the Torres Strait to Thursday Island. End of footnote. The Keeling Cocos Islands, according to Admiral Fitzroy R.N., lie between the latitudes of 11 degrees 50 minutes and 12 degrees 12 minutes south, and the longitudes of 96 degrees 51 minutes and 96 degrees 58 minutes east. They were discovered in 1608 to 1609 by Captain William Keeling, then in the service of the East India Company. The southern group consists of 7 or 8 islands and islets on the atoll, which is the skeleton of what some day, according to the history of coral reefs, will be a continuous island. North Keeling has no harbour, is seldom visited, and is of no importance. South Keelings are a strange little world, with a romantic history all their own. They have been visited occasionally by the floating spar of some hurricane-swept ship, or by a tree that has drifted all the way from Australia, or by an ill-starred ship cast away, and finally by man. Even a rock once drifted to Keeling, held fast among the roots of a tree. After the discovery of the islands by Captain Keeling, their first notable visitor was Captain John Clunies Ross, who in 1814 touched in the ship Borneo on a voyage to India. Captain Ross returned 2 years later with his wife and family and his mother-in-law, Mrs. Dymoke, and 8 sailor artisans, to take possession of the islands, but found there already one Alexander Hare, who meanwhile had marked the little atoll as a sort of Eden for a seraglio of Malay women, which he moved over from the coast of Africa. It was Ross's own brother, oddly enough, who freighted Hare and his crowd of women to the islands, not knowing of Captain John's plans to occupy the little world. And so Hare was there with his outfit, as if he had come to stay. On his previous visit, however, Ross had nailed the English Jack to a mast on Horsburgh Island, one of the group. After 2 years, shreds of it still fluttered in the wind, and his sailors, nothing loath, began at once the invasion of the new kingdom to take possession of it, women and all. The force of 40 women, with only 1 man to command them, was not equal to driving 8 sturdy sailors back into the sea. Footnote. In the accounts given in Findlay's Sailing Directory of some of the events there is a chronological discrepancy. I follow the accounts gathered from the old captain's grandsons and from records on the spot. End of footnote. From this time on, Hare had a hard time of it. He and Ross did not get on well as neighbours. The islands were too small and too near for characters so widely different. Hare had oceans of money, and might have lived well in London, but he had been governor of a wild colony in Borneo, and could not confine himself to the tame life that prosy civilization affords. And so he hung on to the atoll with his 40 women, retreating little by little before Ross and his sturdy crew, till at last he found himself and his harem on the little island known to this day as Prison Island, where, like Bluebeard, he confined his wives in a castle. The channel between the islands was narrow, the water was not deep, and the 8 Scotch sailors wore long boots. Hare was now dismayed. He tried to compromise with rum and other luxuries, but these things only made matters worse. On the day following the first St. Andrew's celebration on the island, Hare, consumed with rage, and no longer on speaking terms with the captain, dashed off a note to him, saying, "Dear Ross, I thought when I sent rum and roast pig to your sailors that they would stay away from my flower garden." In reply to which the captain, burning with indignation, shouted from the centre of the island where he stood, "Ahoy there, on Prison Island! You, Hare, don't you know that rum and roast pig are not a sailor's heaven?" Hare said afterwards that one might have heard the captain's roar across to Java. The lawless establishment was soon broken up by the women deserting Prison Island and putting themselves under Ross's protection. Hare then went to Batavia, where he met his death. My first impression on landing was that the crime of infanticide had not reached the islands of Keeling Cocos. "The children have all come to welcome you," explained Mr. Ross, "and they mustered at the jetty by hundreds, of all ages and sizes. The people of this country were all rather shy, but, young or old, they never passed one or saw one passing their door without a salutation. In their musical voices they would say, 'Are you walking? Halan, halan!' 'Will you come along?' one would answer. For a long time after I arrived, the children regarded the one-man ship with suspicion and fear. A native man had been blown away to sea many years before, and they hinted to one another that he might have been changed from black to white and returned in the sloop. For some time every movement I made was closely watched. They were particularly interested in what I ate. One day, after I had been boot-topping the sloop with a composition of coal tar and other stuff, and while I was taking my dinner with the luxury of blackberry jam, I heard a commotion, and then a yell and a stampede, and the children ran away yelling, 'The captain is eating coal tar! The captain is eating coal tar!' But they soon found out that this same coal tar was very good to eat, and that I had brought a quantity of it. One day, when I was spreading a sea biscuit thick with it for a wide-awake youngster, I heard them whisper, 'Shut, shut!' meaning that a shark had bitten my hand, which they observed was lame. Thenceforth they regarded me as a hero, and I had not fingers enough for the little bright-eyed tots that wanted to cling to them and follow me about. Before this, when I held out my hand and said, 'Come,' they would shy off for the nearest house, and say, 'Ding jing, it's cold,' or 'Ujan, it's going to rain.' But it was now accepted that I was not the returned spirit of the lost black, and I had plenty of friends about the island, rain or shine. One day after this, when I tried to haul the sloop and found her fast in the sand, the children all clapped their hands and cried that a pting, or crab, was holding her by the keel. And little Ophelia, 10 or 12 years of age, wrote in the Spray's logbook, 100 men with might and main on the windlace hove, yea-ho! The cable only came in twain, the ship she would not go. For child, to tell the strangest thing, the keel was held by a great pting." This being so or not, it was decided that the Mohammedan priest, Sama the Imam, for a pot of jam, should ask Mohammed to bless the voyage and make the crab let go the sloop's keel, which it did, if it had hold, and she floated on the very next tide. On the 22nd of July arrived HMS Iphigenia with Mr. Justice Andrew L. Leach and court officers on board, on a circuit of inspection among the Strait settlements of which Keeling Cocos was a dependency, to hear complaints and try cases by law, if any there were to try. They found the Spray hauled ashore and tied to a coconut tree. But at the Keeling Islands there had not been a grievance to complain of since the day that Hare migrated, for the Rosses have always treated the islanders as their own family. If there is a paradise on earth, it is Keeling. There was not a case for a lawyer, but something had to be done, for here were 2 ships in port, a great man-of-war and the Spray. Instead of a lawsuit, a dance was got up, and all the officers who could leave their ship came ashore. Everybody on the island came, old and young, and the governor's great hall was filled with people. All that could get on their feet danced, while the babies lay in heaps in the corners of the room, content to look on. My little friend Ophelia danced with the judge. For music, 2 fiddles screeched over and over again the good old tune, "We won't go home till morning," and we did not. The women in the keelings do not do all the drudgery, as in many places visited on the voyage. It would cheer the heart of a Fuegian woman to see the keeling lord of creation up a coconut tree. Besides cleverly climbing the trees, the men of Keeling build exquisitely modelled canoes. By far the best workmanship in boat building I saw on the voyages was here. Many finished mechanics dwelt under the palms at Keeling, and the hum of the bandsaw and the ring of the anvil were heard from morning till night. The first Scotch settlers left there the strength of northern blood, and the inheritance of steady habits. No benevolent society has ever done so much for the islanders as the noble Captain Ross and his sons, who have followed his example of industry and thrift. Admiral Fitzroy of the Beagle, who visited here where many things are reversed, spoke of these singular though small islands, where crabs eat coconuts, fish eat coral, dogs catch fish, men ride on turtles, and shells are dangerous man-traps, adding that the greater part of the seafowl roost on branches, and many rats make their nests in the tops of palm trees. My vessel being refitted, I decided to load her with the famous mammoth tradactus shell of Keeling, found in the bayou nearby, and right here within sight of the village I came near losing the crew of the Spray. Not from putting my foot in a man-trap shell, however, but from carelessly neglecting to look after the details of a trip across the harbour in a boat. I had sailed over oceans. I have since completed a course over them all, and sailed round the whole world without so nearly meeting a fatality as on that trip across a lagoon, where I trusted all to someone else, and he, weak mortal that he was, perhaps trusted all to me. However that may be, I found myself with a thoughtless African negro in a rickety bateau that was fitted with a rotten sail, and this blew away in mid-channel in a squall that sent us drifting helplessly to sea, where we should have been incontinently lost. With the whole ocean before us to leeward, I was dismayed to see, while we drifted, that there was not a paddle or an oar in the boat. There was an anchor, to be sure, but not enough rope to tie a cat, and we were already in deep water. By great good fortune, however, there was a pole. Plying this as a paddle with the utmost energy, and by the merest accidental flaw in the wind to favour us, the trap of the boat was worked into shoal water, where we could touch bottom and push her ashore. With Africa, the nearest coast, to leeward 3,000 miles away, with not so much as a drop of water in the boat, and a lean and hungry negro, well, cast the lot as one might, the crew of the Spray in a little while would have been hard to find. It is needless to say that I took no more such chances. The Tradacna were afterwards procured in a safe boat, 30 of them taking the place of 3 tons of cement ballast, which I threw overboard to make room and give buoyancy. On August 22, the Pating, or whatever else it was that held the sloop in the islands, let go its hold, and she swung out to sea under all sail, heading again for home. Mounting 1 or 2 heavy rollers on the fringe of the atoll, she cleared the flashing reefs. Long before dark Keeling Cocos, with its 1,000 souls as sinless in their lives as perhaps it is possible for frail mortals to be, was left out of sight astern. Out of sight, I say, except in my strongest affection. The sea was rugged, and the Spray washed heavily when hauled on the wind, which course I took for the island of Rodriguez, and which brought the sea abeam. The true course for the island was west by south, 1/4 south, and the distance was 1,900 miles. But I steered considerably to the windward of that, to allow for the heave of the sea and other leeward effects. My sloop on this course ran under reefed sails for days together. I naturally tired of the never-ending motion of the sea, and above all of the wetting I got whenever I showed myself on deck. Under these heavy weather conditions, the Spray seemed to lay behind on her course. At least, I attributed to these conditions a discrepancy in the log which, by the 15th day out from Keeling, amounted to 150 miles between the Rotator and the mental calculations I had kept of what she should have gone. And so I kept an eye lifting for land. I could see about sundown this day a bunch of clouds that stood in one spot right ahead, while the other clouds floated on. This was a sign of something. By midnight, as the sloop sailed on, a black object appeared where I had seen the resting clouds. It was still a long way off, but there could be no mistaking this. It was the high island of Rodriguez. I hauled in the patent log, which I was now towing more from habit than from necessity, for I had learned the Spray and her ways long before this. If one thing were clearer than another in her voyage, it was that she could be trusted to come out right and in safety, though at the same time I always stood ready to give her the benefit of even the least doubt. The officers who are oversure and know it all like a book are the ones I have observed who wreck the most ships and lose the most lives. The cause of the discrepancy in the log was one often met with, namely, coming into contact with some large fish, 2 out of the 4 blades of the Rotator were crushed or bent, the work probably of a shark. Being sure of the sloop's position, I lay down to rest and to think, and I felt better for it. By daylight the island was abeam about 3 miles away. It wore a hard, weather-beaten appearance there, all alone, far out in the Indian Ocean, like land adrift. The windward side was uninviting, but there was a good port to leeward, and I hauled in now, close on the wind for that. A pilot came out to take me into the inner harbour, which was reached through a narrow channel among coral reefs. It was a curious thing that at all of the islands some reality was insisted on as unreal, while improbabilities were clothed as hard facts. And so it happened here that the good Abbé, a few days before, had been telling his people about the coming of Antichrist. And when they saw the Spray sail into the harbour, all feather white before a gale of wind, and run all standing upon the beach, and with only one man aboard, they cried, "May the Lord help us! It is he, and he has come in a boat!" Which I say would have been the most improbable way of his coming. Nevertheless, the news went flying through the place. The governor of the island, Mr. Roberts, came down immediately to see what it was all about, for the little town was in a great commotion. One elderly woman, when she heard of my advent, made for her house and locked herself in. When she heard that I was actually coming up the street, she barricaded her doors and did not come out while I was on the island, a period of 8 days. Governor Roberts and his family did not share the fears of their people, but came on board at the jetty where the sloop was berthed, and their example induced others to come also. The governor's young boys took charge of the Spray's dinghy at once, and my visit cost His Excellency, besides great hospitality to me, the building of a boat for them like the one belonging to the Spray. My first day in this land of promise was to me like a fairy tale. For many days I had studied the charts, and counted the time of my arrival at this spot as one might his entrance to the islands of the blessed, looking upon it as the terminus of the last long run, made irksome by the want of many things with which, from this time on, I could keep well supplied. And behold, here saw the sloop arrived and made securely fast to a pier in Rodriguez. On the first evening ashore, in the land of napkins and cut glass, I saw before me still the ghosts of hempen towels and mugs with handles knocked off. Instead of tossing on the sea, however, as I might have been, here was I in a bright hall, surrounded by sparkling wit, and dining with the governor of the island. "Aladdin," I cried, "where is your lamp? My fisherman's lantern, which I got at Gloucester, has shown me better things than your smoky old burner ever revealed." The second day in port was spent in receiving visitors. Mrs. Roberts and her children came first to shake hands, they said, with the Spray. No one was now afraid to come on board, except the poor old woman, who still maintained that the Spray had Antichrist in the hold, if indeed he had not already gone ashore. The governor entertained that evening, and kindly invited the destroyer of the world to speak for himself. This he did, elaborating most effusively on the dangers of the sea, which, after the manner of many of our frailest mortals, he would have had smooth had he made it. Also, by contrivances of light and darkness, he exhibited on the wall pictures of the places and countries visited on the voyage, nothing like the countries, however, that he would have made, and of the people seen, savage and other, frequently groaning, "Wicked world! Wicked world!" When this was finished, His Excellency the Governor, speaking words of thankfulness, distributed pieces of gold. On the following day I accompanied His Excellency and family on a visit to St. Gabriel, which was up the country among the hills. The good Abbé of St. Gabriel entertained us all royally at the convent, and we remained his guests until the following day. As I was leaving his place, the Abbé said, "Captain, I embrace you, and of whatever religion you may be, my wish is that you succeed in making your voyage, and that our Saviour the Christ be always with you." To this good man's words I could only say, "My dear Abbé, had all religionists been so liberal, there would have been less bloodshed in the world." At Rodriguez one may now find every convenience for filling pure and wholesome water in any quantity, Governor Roberts having built a reservoir in the hills above the village, and laid pipes to the jetty, where, at the time of my visit, there were 5½ feet at high tide. In former years well water was used, and more or less sickness occurred from it. Beef may be had in any quantity on the island, and at a moderate price. Sweet potatoes were plentiful and cheap. The large sack of them that I bought there for about 4 shillings kept unusually well. I simply stored them in the sloop's dry hold. Of fruits, pomegranates were the most plentiful. For 2 shillings I obtained a large sack of them, as many as a donkey could pack from the orchard, which, by the way, was planted by Nature herself. End of chapter 16. Read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. Chapter 17 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 17, consisting of a clean bill of health at Mauritius, sailing the voyage over again in the Opera House, a newly discovered plant named in honour of the Spray's skipper, a party of young ladies out for a sail, a bivouac on deck, a warm reception at Durban, a friendly cross-examination by Henry M. Stanley, 3 wise Boers seek proof of the flatness of the earth, leaving South Africa. On the 16th of September, after 8 restful days at Rodriguez, the mid-ocean land of plenty, I set sail, and on the 19th arrived at Mauritius, anchoring at Quarantine about noon. The sloop was towed in later on the same day by the doctor's launch, after he was satisfied that I had mustered all the crew for inspection. Of this he seemed in doubt, until he examined the papers, which called for a crew of 1 all told, from port to port throughout the voyage. Then, finding that I had been well enough to come thus far alone, he gave me pratique without further ado. There was still another official visit for the Spray to pass farther in the harbour. The governor of Rodriguez, who had most kindly given me besides a regular mail, private letters of introduction to friends, told me I should meet first of all Mr. Jenkins of the Postal Service, a good man. "How do you do, Mr. Jenkins?" cried I, as his boat swung alongside. "You don't know me?" he said. "Why not?" I replied. "From where is the sloop?" "From around the world," I again replied, very solemnly. "And alone?" "Yes, why not?" "And you know me?" 3,000 years ago," cried I, "when you and I had a warmer job than we have now." Even this was hot. "You were then Jenkinson, but if you have changed your name, I don't blame you for that." Mr. Jenkins, forbearing soul, entered into the spirit of the jest, which served the Spray a good turn, for on the strength of this tale it got out that if anyone should go on board after dark, the devil would get him at once. And so I could leave the Spray without the fear of her being robbed at night. The cabin, to be sure, was broken into, but it was done in daylight, and the thieves got no more than a box of smoked herrings before Tom Ledson, one of the port officials, caught them red-handed, as it were, and sent them to jail. This was discouraging to pilferers, for they feared Ledson more than they feared Satan himself. Even Mahmoud Haji Ayub, who was the day watchman on board, till an empty box fell over in the cabin and frightened him out of his wits, could not be hired to watch nights, or even till the sun went down. "Sahib," he cried, "there is no need of it." And what he said was perfectly true. At Mauritius, where I drew a long breath, the Spray rested her wings, it being the season of fine weather. The hardships of the voyage, if there had been any, were now computed by officers of experience as 9/10 finished. And yet somehow I could not forget that the United States was still a long way off. The kind people of Mauritius, to make me richer and happier, rigged up the opera house, which they had named the ship Pantai. Footnote: Guinea hen. All decks and no bottom was this ship, but she was as stiff as a church. They gave me free use of it while I talked over the Spray's adventures. His Honour the Mayor introduced me to His Excellency the Governor from the poop deck of the Pantai. In this way I was also introduced again to our good Consul, General John P. Campbell, who had already introduced me to His Excellency. I was becoming well acquainted, and was in for it now to sail the voyage over again. How I got through the story I hardly know. It was a hot night, and I could have choked the tailor who made the coat I wore for this occasion. The kind governor saw that I had done my part trying to rig like a man ashore, and he invited me to Government House at Reduit, where I found myself among friends. It was winter still off stormy Cape of Good Hope, but the storms might whistle there. I determined to see it out in the milder Mauritius, visiting Rose Hill, Curipepe, and other places on the island. I spent a day with the elder Mr. Roberts, father of Governor Roberts of Rodriguez, and with his friends, the very reverend fathers O'Loughlin and McCarthy. Returning to the Spray by way of the great flower conservatory near Mocha, the proprietor, having only that morning discovered a new and hardy plant, to my great honour named it Slocum, which, he said, Latinized it at once, saving him some trouble on the twist of a word. And the good botanist seemed pleased that I had come. How different things are in different countries. In Boston, Massachusetts, at that time, a gentleman, so I was told, paid $30,000 to have a flower named after his wife. And it was not a big flower either, while Slocum, which came without the asking, was bigger than a mangel wurzel. I was royally entertained at Mocha, as well as Reduit and other places, once by 7 young ladies, to whom I spoke of my inability to return their hospitality, except in my own poor way of taking them on a sail in the sloop. "The very thing, the very thing!" they all cried. "Then please name the time," I said, as meek as Moses. "Tomorrow," they all cried. "And, Auntie, we may go, mayn't we? and we'll be real good for a whole week afterwards, Auntie. Say yes, Auntie dear." All this after saying tomorrow, for girls in Mauritius are, after all, the same as our girls in America, and their dear aunt said, "Me too," about the same as any really good aunt might say in my own country. I was then in a quandary, it having recurred to me that on the very tomorrow I was to dine with the harbour-master, Captain Wilson. However, I said to myself, the Spray will run out quickly into rough seas, these young ladies will have mal de mer and a good time, and I'll get in early enough to be at the dinner after all. But not a bit of it. We sailed almost out of sight of Mauritius, and they just stood up and laughed at seas tumbling aboard, while I was at the helm making the worst weather of it I could, and spinning yarns to the aunt about sea serpents and whales. But she, dear lady, when I had finished with stories of monsters, only hinted at a basket of provisions they had brought along, enough to last a week, for I had told them about my wretched steward. The more the Spray tried to make these young ladies seasick, the more they all clapped hands and said how lovely it is, and how beautifully she skims over the sea, and how beautiful our island appears from the distance. And they still cried, "Go on!" We were 15 miles or more at sea before they ceased the eager cry, "Go on!" Then the sloop swung round. I was still hoping to be back at Port Louis in time to keep my appointment. The Spray reached the island quickly and flew along the coast fast enough, but I made a mistake in steering along the coast on the way home, for as we came abreast of Tombo Bay, it enchanted my crew. "Oh, let's anchor here!" they cried. To this no sailor in the world would have said nay. The sloop came to anchor 10 minutes later, as they wished, and a young man on the cliff abreast, waving his hat, cried, "Vive le Spray!" My passengers said, "Auntie, mayn't we have a swim in the surf along the shore?" Just then the harbour-master's launch hove in sight, coming out to meet us, but it was too late to get the sloop into Port Louis that night. The launch was in time, however, to land my fair crew for a swim. But they were determined not to desert the ship. Meanwhile, I prepared a roof for the night on deck with the sails, and a Bengali manservant arranged the evening meal. That night the Spray rode in Tombo Bay with her precious freight. Next morning, bright and early, even before the stars were gone, I awoke to hear praying on deck. The port officer's launch reappeared later in the morning, this time with Captain Wilson himself on board, to try his luck at getting the Spray into port, for he had heard of our predicament. It was worth something to hear a friend tell afterwards how earnestly the good harbour-master of Mauritius said, "I'll find the Spray and get her into port." A merry crew he discovered on her. They could hoist sails like old tars, and could trim them too. They could tell all about the ship's hoods, and one should have seen them clap a bonnet on the jib. Like the deepest of deep-water sailors, they could heave the lead, and, as I hope to see Mauritius again, any of them could have put the ship in stays. No ship ever had a fairer crew. The voyage was the event of Port Louis. Such a thing as young ladies sailing about the harbour even was almost unheard of before. While at Mauritius, the Spray was tendered the use of the military dock free of charge, and was thoroughly refitted by the port authorities. My sincere gratitude is also due other friends for many things needful for the voyage put on board, including bags of sugar from some of the famous old plantations. The favourable season now set in, and thus well equipped, on the 26th of October the Spray put to sea. As I sailed before a light wind, the island receded slowly, and on the following day I could still see the Puce Mountain near Mocha. The Spray arrived next day off Galet's Réunion, and a pilot came out and spoke to her. I handed him a Mauritius paper and continued on my voyage, for rollers were running heavily at the time, and it was not practicable to make a landing. From Réunion I shaped a course direct for Cape St. Mary, Madagascar. The sloop was now drawing near the limits of the trade wind, and the strong breeze that had carried her with free sheets the many thousands of miles from Sandy Cape, Australia, fell lighter each day until October 30, when it was altogether calm, and a motionless sea held her in a hushed world. I furled the sails at evening, sat down on deck, and enjoyed the vast stillness of the night. October 31, a light east-northeast breeze sprang up, and the sloop passed Cape St. Mary about noon. On the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th of November, in the Mozambique Channel, she experienced a hard gale of wind from the southwest. Here the Spray suffered as much as she did elsewhere, except off Cape Horn. The thunder and lightning preceding this gale were very heavy. From this point until the sloop arrived off the coast of Africa, she encountered a succession of gales of wind which drove her about in many directions, but on the 17th of November she arrived at Port Natal. This delightful place is the commercial centre of the garden colony, Durban itself, the city, being the continuation of a garden. The signalman from the Bluff station reported the Spray 15 miles off. The wind was freshening, and when she was within 8 miles, he said, "The Spray is shortening sail. The mainsail was reefed and set in 10 minutes. One man is doing all the work." This item of news was printed 3 minutes later in a Durban morning journal, which was handed to me when I arrived in port. I could not verify the time it had taken to reef the sail, for, as I have already said, the minute hand of my timepiece was gone. I only knew that I reefed as quickly as I could. The same paper, commenting on the voyage, said, "Judging from the stormy weather which has prevailed off this coast during the past few weeks, the Spray must have had a very stormy voyage from Mauritius to Natal. Doubtless the weather would have been called stormy by sailors in any ship, but it caused the Spray no more inconvenience than the delay natural to headwinds generally." The question of how I sailed the sloop alone, often asked, is best answered perhaps by a Durban newspaper. I would shrink from repeating the editor's words, but for the reason that undue estimates have been made of the amount of skill and energy required to sail a sloop of even the Spray's small tonnage. I heard a man who called himself a sailor say that it would require 3 men to do what it was claimed that I did alone, and what I found perfectly easy to do over and over again. And I have heard that others made similar nonsensical remarks, adding that I would work myself to death. But here is what the Durban paper said. "As briefly noted yesterday, the Spray with a crew of 1 man arrived at this port yesterday afternoon on her cruise round the world. The Spray made quite an auspicious entrance to Natal. Her commander sailed his craft right up the channel past the main wharf and dropped his anchor near the old Forerunner in the creek, before anyone had a chance to get on board. The Spray was naturally an object of great curiosity to the Point people, and her arrival was witnessed by a large crowd. The skilful manner in which Captain Slocum steered his craft about the vessels which were occupying the waterway was a treat to witness. The Spray was not sailing in among greenhorns when she came to Natal. When she arrived off the port, the pilot ship, a fine able steam tug, came out to meet her, and led the way in across the bar, for it was blowing a smart gale, and was too rough for the sloop to be towed with safety. The trick of going in I learned by watching the steamer. It was simply to keep on the windward side of the channel and take the combers end on. I found that Durban supported 2 yacht clubs, both of them full of enterprise. I met all the members of both clubs, and sailed in the crack yacht Florence of the Royal Natal, with Captain Spradbrow and the Right Honourable Harry Escombe, Premier of the colony. The yacht's centreboard ploughed furrows through the mud banks, which, according to Mr. Escombe, Spradbrow afterwards planted with potatoes. The Florence, however, won races while she tilled the skipper's land. After our sail on the Florence, Mr. Escombe offered to sail the Spray round the Cape of Good Hope for me, and hinted at his famous cribbage board to while away the hours. Spradbrow in retort warned me of it. Said he, "You would be played out of the sloop before you could round the Cape." By others it was not thought probable that the Premier of Natal would play cribbage off the Cape of Good Hope to win even the Spray. It was a matter of no small pride to me in South Africa to find that American humour was never at a discount, and one of the best American stories I ever heard was told by the Premier. At Hotel Royal one day, dining with Colonel Sanderson, MP, his son, and Lieutenant Tipping, I met Mr. Stanley. The great explorer was just from Pretoria, and had already as good as flayed President Kruger with his trenchant pen. But that did not signify, for everybody has a whack at Umpool, and no one in the world seems to stand the joke better than he, not even the Sultan of Turkey himself. The Colonel introduced me to the explorer, and I hauled close to the wind to go slow, for Mr. Stanley was a nautical man once himself, on the Nyanza, I think, and of course my desire was to appear in the best light before a man of his experience. He looked me over carefully and said, "What an example of patience!" "Patience is all that is required," I ventured to reply. He then asked if my vessel had watertight compartments. I explained that she was all watertight and all compartment. "What if she should strike a rock?" he said. "Compartments would not save her if she should hit rocks lying along her course," said I, adding, "she must be kept away from the rocks." After a considerable pause, Mr. Stanley asked, "What if a swordfish should pierce her hull with its sword?" Of course I had thought of that as one of the dangers of the sea, and also of the chance of being struck by lightning. In the case of the swordfish, I ventured to say that the first thing would be to secure the sword. The Colonel invited me to dine with the party on the following day, that we might go further into this matter, and so I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Stanley a second time, but got no more hints in navigation from the famous explorer. It sounds odd to hear scholars and statesmen say the world is flat, but it is a fact that 3 Boers, favoured by the opinion of President Kruger, prepared a work to support that contention. While I was at Durban, they came from Pretoria to obtain data from me, and they seemed annoyed when I told them that they could not prove it by my experience. With the advice to call up some ghost of the Dark Ages for research, I went ashore, and left these 3 wise men poring over the Spray's track on a chart of the world, which, however, proved nothing to them, for it was on Mercator's projection, and behold, it was flat. The next morning I met one of the party in a clergyman's garb, carrying a large Bible, not different from the one I had read. He tackled me, saying, "If you respect the Word of God, you must admit that the world is flat." "If the Word of God stands on a flat world," I began. "What?" cried he, losing himself in a passion, and making as if he would run me through with an assegai. "What?" he shouted in astonishment and rage, while I jumped aside to dodge the imaginary weapon. Had this good but misguided fanatic been armed with a real weapon, the crew of the Spray would have died a martyr there and then. The next day, seeing him across the street, I bowed and made curves with my hand. He responded with a level swimming movement of his hands, meaning the world is flat. A pamphlet by these Transvaal geographers, made up of arguments from sources high and low to prove their theory, was mailed to me before I sailed from Africa on my last stretch around the globe. While I feebly portray the ignorance of these learned men, I have great admiration for their physical manhood. Much that I saw first and last of the Transvaal and the Boers was admirable. It is well known that they are the hardest of fighters, and as generous to the fallen as they are brave before the foe. Real stubborn bigotry with them is only found among old fogies, and will die a natural death, and that too perhaps long before we ourselves are entirely free from bigotry. Education in the Transvaal is by no means neglected. English as well as Dutch is taught to all that can afford both, but the tariff duty on English school books is heavy, and from necessity the poorer people stick to the Transvaal Dutch and their flat world, just as in Samoa and other islands a mistaken policy has kept the natives down to Kanaka. I visited many public schools in Durban, and had the pleasure of meeting many bright children. But all fine things must end, and December 14, 1897, the crew of the Spray, after having a fine time in Natal, swung the sloop's dinghy in on deck, and sailed with a morning land wind, which carried her clear of the bar, and again she was off on her alone, as they say in Australia. End of chapter 17. Read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. Chapter 18 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 18, consisting of Rounding the Cape of Storms in Olden Time, A Rough Christmas, The Spray ties up for a 3 months' rest at Cape Town, A railway trip to the Transvaal, President Kruger's odd definition of the Spray's voyage, his terse sayings, distinguished guests on the Spray, coconut fibre as a padlock, courtesies from the Admiral of the Queen's Navy, off for St. Helena, land in sight. The Cape of Good Hope was now the most prominent point to pass. From Table Bay I could count on the aid of brisk trades, and then the Spray would soon be at home. On the first day out from Durban it fell calm, and I sat thinking about these things and the end of the voyage. The distance to Table Bay, where I intended to call, was about 800 miles, over what might prove a rough sea. The early Portuguese navigators, endowed with patience, were more than 69 years struggling to round this cape before they got as far as Algoa Bay, and there the crew mutinied. They landed on a small island, now called Santa Cruz, where they devoutly set up the cross and swore they would cut the captain's throat if he attempted to sail further. Beyond this, they thought, was the edge of the world, which they too believed was flat, and fearing that their ship would sail over the brink of it, they compelled Captain Diaz, their commander, to retrace his course, all being only too glad to get home. A year later, we are told, Vasco da Gama sailed successfully round the Cape of Storms, as the Cape of Good Hope was then called, and discovered Natal on Christmas or Natal Day, hence the name. From this point the way to India was easy. Gales of wind sweeping round the Cape even now were frequent enough, one occurring on an average every 36 hours. But one gale was much the same as another, with no more serious result than to blow the Spray along on her course when it was fair, or to blow her back somewhat when it was ahead. On Christmas 1897 I came to the pitch of the Cape. On this day the Spray was trying to stand on her head, and she gave me every reason to believe that she would accomplish the feat before night. She began very early in the morning to pitch and toss about in a most unusual manner, and I have to record that, while I was at the end of the bowsprit reefing the jib, she ducked me under water 3 times for a Christmas box. I got wet, and did not like it a bit. Never in any other sea was I ever put under more than once in the same short space of time, say 3 minutes. A large English steamer passing ran up the signal, "Wishing you a Merry Christmas." I think the captain was a humorist. His own ship was throwing her propeller out of water. 2 days later, the Spray, having recovered the distance lost in the gale, passed Cape Agulhas in company with the steamship Scotsman, now with a fair wind. The keeper of the light on Agulhas exchanged signals with the Spray as she passed, and afterward wrote me at New York congratulations on the completion of the voyage. He seemed to think the incident of 2 ships of so widely differing types passing his cape together worthy of a place on canvas, and he went about having the picture made. So I gathered from his letter. At lonely stations like this, hearts grow responsive and sympathetic, and even poetic. This feeling was shown towards the Spray along many a rugged coast, and reading many a kind signal thrown out to her gave one a grateful feeling for all the world. One more gale of wind came down upon the Spray from the west after she passed Cape Agulhas, but that one she dodged by getting into Simon's Bay. When it moderated, she beat round the Cape of Good Hope, where, they say, the Flying Dutchman is still sailing. The voyage then seemed as good as finished. From this time on, I knew that all, or nearly all, would be plain sailing. Here I crossed the dividing line of weather. To the north it was clear and settled, while south it was humid and squally, with, often enough, as I have said, a treacherous gale. From the recent hard weather the Spray ran into a calm under Table Mountain, where she lay quietly till the generous sun rose over the land and drew a breeze in from the sea. The steam tug Alert, then out looking for ships, came to the Spray off the Lion's Rump, and in lieu of a larger ship towed her into port. The sea being smooth, she came to anchor in the bay off the city of Cape Town, where she remained a day, simply to rest clear of the bustle of commerce. The good harbour-master sent his steam launch to bring the sloop to a berth in dock at once, but I preferred to remain for 1 day alone in the quiet of a smooth sea, enjoying the retrospect of the passage of the 2 great capes. On the following morning the Spray sailed into the Alfred dry docks, where she remained for about 3 months in the care of the port authorities, while I travelled the country over from Simonstown to Pretoria, being accorded by the colonial government a free railroad pass over all the land. The trip to Kimberley, Johannesburg, and Pretoria was a pleasant one. At the last named place I met Mr. Kruger, the Transvaal President. His Excellency received me cordially enough, but my friend Judge Bayers, the gentleman who presented me, by mentioning that I was on a voyage around the world, unwittingly gave great offence to the venerable statesman, which we both regretted deeply. Mr. Kruger corrected the judge rather sharply, reminding him that the world is flat. "You don't mean round the world," said the President. "It is impossible. You mean in the world." "Impossible," he said, "impossible." And not another word did he utter either to the judge or to me. The judge looked at me, and I looked at the judge, who should have known his ground, so to speak, and Mr. Kruger glowered at us both. My friend the judge seemed embarrassed, but I was delighted. The incident pleased me more than anything else that could have happened. It was a nugget of information quarried out of Umpool, some of whose sayings are famous. Of the English he said, "They first took my coat and then my trousers." He also said, "Dynamite is the cornerstone of the South African Republic." Only unthinking people call President Kruger dull. Soon after my arrival at the Cape, Mr. Kruger's friend, Colonel Sanderson, who had arrived from Durban some time before, invited me to Newlands Vineyard, where I met many agreeable people. Footnote: Colonel Sanderson was Mr. Kruger's very best friend, inasmuch as he advised the President to avast mounting guns. End of footnote. His Excellency Sir Alfred Milner, the Governor, found time to come aboard with a party. The governor, after making a survey of the deck, found a seat on a box in my cabin. Lady Muriel sat on a keg, and Lady Sanderson sat by the skipper at the wheel, while the colonel, with his kodak, away in the dinghy, took snapshots of the sloop and her distinguished visitors. Dr. David Gill, Astronomer Royal, who was of the party, invited me the next day to the famous Cape Observatory. An hour with Dr. Gill was an hour among the stars. His discoveries in stellar photography are well known. He showed me the great astronomical clock of the observatory, and I showed him the tin clock of the Spray, and we went over the subject of standard time at sea, and how it was found from the deck of the little sloop without the aid of a clock of any kind. Later, it was advertised that Dr. Gill would preside at a talk about the voyage of the Spray. That alone secured for me a full house. The hall was packed, and many were not able to get in. This success brought me sufficient money for all my needs in port and for the homeward voyage. After visiting Kimberley and Pretoria, and finding the Spray all right in the docks, I returned to Worcester and Wellington, towns famous for colleges and seminaries, past coming in, still travelling as the guest of the colony. The ladies of all these institutions of learning wished to know how one might sail round the world alone, which I thought augured of sailing mistresses in the future, instead of sailing masters. It will come to that yet if we menfolk keep on saying we can't. On the plains of Africa I passed through hundreds of miles of rich but still barren lands, save for scrub bushes on which herds of sheep were browsing. The bushes grew about the length of a sheep apart, and they, I thought, were rather long of body, but there was still room for all. My longing for a foothold on land seized upon me here, where so much of it lay waste. But instead of remaining to plant forests and reclaim vegetation, I returned again to the Spray at the Alfred Docks, where I found her waiting for me, with everything in order exactly as I had left her. I have often been asked how it was that my vessel and all appurtenances were not stolen in the various ports where I left her for days together without a watchman in charge. This is just how it was. The Spray seldom fell among thieves. At the Keeling Islands, at Rodriguez, and at many such places, a wisp of cocoa-nut fibre in the door latch, to indicate that the owner was away, secured the goods against even a longing glance. But when I came to a great island nearer home, stout locks were needed. The first night in port, things which I had always left uncovered disappeared, as if the deck on which they were stowed had been swept by a sea. A pleasant visit from Admiral Sir Harry Rawson of the Royal Navy and his family brought to an end the Spray's social relations with the Cape of Good Hope. The Admiral, then commanding the South African squadron, and now in command of the great Channel Fleet, evinced the greatest interest in the diminutive Spray and her behaviour off Cape Horn, where he was not an entire stranger. I have to admit that I was delighted with the trend of Admiral Rawson's questions, and that I profited by some of his suggestions, notwithstanding the wide difference in our respective commands. On March 26, 1898, the Spray sailed from South Africa, the land of distances and pure air, where she had spent a pleasant and profitable time. The steam tug Tigra towed her to sea from her wonted berth at the Alfred Docks, giving her a good offing. The light morning breeze, which scantily filled her sails when the tug let go the tow-line, soon died away altogether, and left her riding over a heavy swell, in full view of Table Mountain and the high peaks of the Cape of Good Hope. For a while the grand scenery served to relieve the monotony. One of the old circumnavigators, Sir Francis Drake, I think, when he first saw this magnificent pile, sang, "'Tis the fairest thing and the grandest cape I've seen in the whole circumference of the earth." The view was certainly fine, but one has no wish to linger long to look in a calm at anything, and I was glad to note finally the short heaving sea precursor of the wind which followed on the second day. Seals, playing about the spray all day before the breeze came, looked with large eyes when, at evening, she sat no longer like a lazy bird with folded wings. They parted company now, and the spray soon sailed the highest peaks of the mountains out of sight, and the world changed from a mere panoramic view to the light of a homeward-bound voyage. Porpoises and dolphins, and such other fishes as did not mind making 150 miles a day, were her companions now for several days. The wind was from the southeast. This suited the spray well, and she ran along steadily at her best speed, while I dipped into the new books given me at the Cape, reading day and night. March 30 was for me a fast day in honour of them. I read on, oblivious of hunger or wind or sea, thinking that all was going well, when suddenly a comber rolled over the stern and slopped saucily into the cabin, wetting the very book I was reading. Evidently it was time to put in a reef, that she might not wallow on her course. March 31, the fair southeast wind had come to stay. The spray was running under a single-reefed mainsail, a whole jib, and a flying jib besides, set on the Vailima bamboo, while I was reading Stevenson's delightful Inland Voyage. The sloop was again doing her work smoothly, hardly rolling at all, but just leaping along among the white horses, 1,000 gambolling porpoises keeping her company on all sides. She was again among her old friends, the flying fish, interesting denizens of the sea, shooting out of the waves like arrows, and with outstretched wings they sailed on the wind in graceful curves, then falling till again they touched the crest of the waves to wet their delicate wings and renew the flight. They made merry the livelong day. One of the joyful sights on the ocean of a bright day is the continual flight of these interesting fish. One could not be lonely in a sea like this. Moreover, the reading of delightful adventures enhanced the scene. I was now in the spray, and on the Oise, in the Arethusa at one and the same time. And so the spray reeled off the miles, showing a good run every day till April 11, which came almost before I knew it. Very early that morning I was awakened by that rare bird, the booby, with its harsh quack, which I recognized at once as a call to go on deck. It was as much as to say, "Skipper, there's land in sight." I tumbled out quickly, and sure enough, away ahead in the dim twilight, about 20 miles off, was St. Helena. My first impulse was to call out, "Oh, what a speck in the sea!" It is in reality 9 miles in length and 2,823 feet in height. I reached for a bottle of port wine out of the locker, and took a long pull from it to the health of my invisible helmsman, the pilot of the Pinta. End of chapter 18, read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. Chapter 19 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 19, consisting of In the Isle of Napoleon's Exile. 2 lectures. A guest in the ghost room at Plantation House. An excursion to historic Longwood. Coffee in the husk and a goat to shell it. The spray's ill luck with animals. A prejudice against small dogs. A rat, the Boston spider, and the cannibal cricket. Ascension Island. It was about noon when the spray came to anchor off Jamestown, and all hands at once went ashore to pay respects to His Excellency the Governor of the island, Sir R. A. Sterndale. His Excellency, when I landed, remarked that it was not often nowadays that a circumnavigator came his way, and he cordially welcomed me and arranged that I should tell about the voyage, first at Garden Hall to the people of Jamestown, and then at Plantation House, the Governor's residence, which is in the hills a mile or two back, to His Excellency and the officers of the garrison and their friends. Mr. Poole, our worthy consul, introduced me at the castle, and in the course of his remarks asserted that the Sea Serpent was a Yankee. Most royally was the crew of the Spray entertained by the Governor. I remained at Plantation House a couple of days, and one of the rooms in the mansion, called the West Room, being haunted, the butler, by command of His Excellency, put me up in that, like a prince. Indeed, to make sure that no mistake had been made, His Excellency came later to see that I was in the right room, and to tell me about the ghosts he had seen or heard of. He had discovered all but one, and wishing me pleasant dreams, he hoped I might have the honour of a visit from the unknown one of the West Room. For the rest of the chilly night I kept the candle burning, and often looked out from under the blankets, thinking that maybe I should meet the great Napoleon face to face. But I saw only furniture, and the horseshoe that was nailed over the door opposite my bed. St. Helena has been an island of tragedies that have been lost sight of in whaling over the Corsican. On the second day of my visit, the Governor took me by carriage road through the turns over the island. At one point of our journey, the road, in winding around spurs and ravines, formed a perfect W within the distance of a few rods. The roads, though tortuous and steep, were fairly good, and I was struck with the amount of labour it must have cost to build them. The air on the heights was cool and bracing. It is said that, since hanging for trivial offences went out of fashion, no one has died there, except from falling over the cliffs in old age, or from being crushed by stones rolling on them from the steep mountains. Witches at one time were persistent at St. Helena, as with us in America in the days of Cotton Mather. At the present day crime is rare in the island. While I was there, Governor Sterndale, in token of the fact that not one criminal case had come to court within the year, was presented with a pair of white gloves by the officers of justice. Returning from the Governor's house to Jamestown, I drove with Mr. Clark, a countryman of mine, to Longwood, the home of Napoleon. Monsieur Morillo, French consular agent in charge, keeps the place respectable and the buildings in good repair. His family at Longwood, consisting of wife and grown daughters, are natives of courtly and refined manners, and spend here days, months, and years of contentment, though they have never seen the world beyond the horizon of St. Helena. On the 20th of April, the Spray was again ready for sea. Before going on board, I took luncheon with the Governor and his family at the castle. Lady Sterndale had sent a large fruit cake early in the morning from Plantation House to be taken along on the voyage. It was a great high-decker, and I ate sparingly of it, as I thought, but it did not keep as I had hoped it would. I ate the last of it, along with my first cup of coffee at Antigua, West Indies, which, after all, was quite a record. The one my own sister made me at the little island in the Bay of Fundy, at the first of the voyage, kept about the same length of time, namely 42 days. After luncheon, a royal mail was made up for Ascension, the island next on my way. Then Mr. Poole and his daughter paid the Spray a farewell visit, bringing me a basket of fruit. It was late in the evening before the anchor was up, and I bore off for the west, loath to leave my new friends. But fresh winds filled the sloop's sails once more, and I watched the beacon light at Plantation House, the Governor's parting signal for the Spray, till the island faded in the darkness astern, and became one with the night, and by midnight the light itself had disappeared below the horizon. When morning came there was no land in sight, but the day went on the same as days before, save for one small incident. Governor Sterndale had given me a bag of coffee in the husk, and Clark, the American, in an evil moment, had put a goat on board, to butt the sack and hustle the coffee beans out of the pods. He urged that the animal, besides being useful, would be as companionable as a dog. I soon found that my sailing companion, this sort of dog with horns, had to be tied up entirely. The mistake I made was that I did not chain him to the mast instead of tying him with grass ropes less securely, and this I learned to my cost. Except for the first day, before the beast got his sea legs on, I had no peace of mind. After that, actuated by a spirit born maybe of his pasturage, this incarnation of evil threatened to devour everything from flying jib to stern davits. He was the worst pirate I met on the whole voyage. He began depredations by eating my chart of the West Indies in the cabin one day while I was about my work forward, thinking that the critter was securely tied on deck by the pumps. Alas, there was not a rope in the sloop proof against that goat's awful teeth. It was clear from the very first that I was having no luck with animals on board. There was the tree crab from the Keeling Islands. No sooner had it got a claw through its prison box than my sea jacket hanging within reach was torn to ribbons. Encouraged by this success, it smashed the box open and escaped into my cabin, tearing up things generally and finally threatening my life in the dark. I had hoped to bring the creature home alive, but this did not prove feasible. Now the goat devoured my straw hat, and so when I arrived in port I had nothing to wear ashore on my head. This last unkind stroke decided his fate. On the 27th of April, the Spray arrived at Ascension, which was garrisoned by a man-of-war crew, and the boatswain of the island came on board. As he stepped out of his boat, the mutinous goat climbed into it, and defied boatswain and crew. I hired them to land the wretch at once, which they were only too willing to do, and there he fell into the hands of a most excellent Scotchman, with the chances that he would never get away. I was destined to sail once more into the depths of solitude, but these experiences had no bad effect upon me. On the contrary, a spirit of charity and even benevolence grew stronger in my nature through the meditation of these supreme hours on the sea. In the loneliness of the dreary country about Cape Horn, I found myself in no mood to make one life less in the world, except in self-defence. And as I sailed, this trait of the hermit character grew, till the mention of killing food animals was revolting to me. However well I may have enjoyed a chicken stew afterwards at Samoa, a new self rebelled at the thought suggested there of carrying chickens to be slain for my table on the voyage. And Mrs. Stevenson, hearing my protest, agreed with me that to kill the companions of my voyage and eat them would be indeed next to murder and cannibalism. As to pet animals, there was no room for a noble large dog on the Spray on so long a voyage, and a small cur was for many years associated in my mind with hydrophobia. I witnessed once the death of a sterling young German from that dreadful disease, and about the same time heard of the death, also by hydrophobia, of the young gentleman who had just written a line of insurance in his company's books for me. I have seen the whole crew of a ship scamper up the rigging to avoid a dog racing about the decks in a fit. It would never do, I thought, for the crew of the Spray to take a canine risk. And with these just prejudices indelibly stamped on my mind, I have, I am afraid, answered impatiently too often the query, "Why didn't you have a dog?" with, "I and the dog wouldn't have been very long in the same boat in any sense." A cat would have been a harmless animal, I dare say, but there was nothing for Puss to do on board, and she is an unsociable animal at best. True, a rat got into my vessel at the Keeling Cocos Islands, and another at Rodriguez, along with a centipede stowed away in the hold. But one of them I drove out of the ship, and the other I caught. This is how it was. For the first one, with infinite pains, I made a trap, looking to its capture and destruction, but the wily rodent, not to be deluded, took the hint, and got ashore the day the thing was completed. It is, according to tradition, a most reassuring sign to find rats coming to a ship, and I had a mind to abide the knowing one of Rodriguez, but a breach of discipline decided the matter against him. While I slept one night, my ship sailing on, he undertook to walk over me, beginning at the crown of my head, concerning which I am always sensitive. I slept lightly. Before his impertinence had got him even to my nose, I cried "Rat!", had him by the tail, and threw him out of the companionway into the sea. As for the centipede, I was not aware of its presence till the wretched insect, all feet and venom, beginning, like the rat, at my head, wakened me by a sharp bite on the scalp. This also was more than I could tolerate. After a few applications of kerosene, the poisonous bite, painful at first, gave no further inconvenience. From this on, for a time, no living thing disturbed my solitude. No insect even was present in my vessel, except the spider and his wife from Boston, now with a family of young spiders. Nothing, I say, till sailing down the last stretch of the Indian Ocean, where mosquitoes came by hundreds from rainwater poured out of the heavens. Simply a barrel of rainwater stood on deck 5 days, I think, in the sun. Then music began. I knew the sound at once. It was the same as heard from Alaska to New Orleans. Again at Cape Town, while dining out one day, I was taken with the sound of a cricket, and Mr. Branscombe, my host, volunteered to capture a pair of them for me. They were sent on board next day in a box labelled Pluto and Scamp. Stowing them away in the binnacle in their own snug box, I left them there without food till I got to sea, a few days. I had never heard of a cricket eating anything. It seems that Pluto was a cannibal, for only the wings of poor Scamp were visible when I opened the lid, and they lay broken on the floor of the prison box. Even with Pluto it had gone hard, for he lay on his back stark and stiff, never to chirrup again. Ascension Island, where the goat was marooned, is called the Stone Frigate RN, and is rated tender to the South African Squadron. It lies in 7 degrees 55 minutes south latitude, and 14 degrees 25 minutes west longitude, being in the very heart of the southeast trade winds, and about 840 miles from the coast of Liberia. It is a mass of volcanic matter, thrown up from the bed of the ocean to the height of 2,818 feet at the highest point above sea level. It is a strategic point, and belonged to Great Britain before it got cold. In the limited but rich soil at the top of the island, among the clouds, vegetation has taken root, and a little scientific farming is carried on under the supervision of a gentleman from Canada. Also a few cattle and sheep are pastured there for the garrison mess. Water storage is made on a large scale. In a word, this heap of cinders and lava rock is stored and fortified, and would stand a siege. Very soon after the Spray arrived, I received a note from Captain Blaxland, the commander of the island, conveying his thanks for the Royal Mail brought from St. Helena, and inviting me to luncheon with him and his wife and sisters at headquarters not far away. It is hardly necessary to say that I availed myself of the captain's hospitality at once. A carriage was waiting up the jetty when I landed, and a sailor with a broad grin led the horse carefully up the hill to the captain's house, as if I were a lord of the Admiralty, and a governor besides. and he let it as carefully down again when I returned. On the following day I visited the summit among the clouds, the same team being provided, and the same old sailor leading the horse. There was probably not a man on the island at that moment better able to walk than I. The sailor knew that. I finally suggested that we change places. "Let me take the bridle," I said, "and keep the horse from bolting." "Great stone frigate!" he exclaimed, as he burst into a laugh. "This here horse wouldn't bolt no faster than a turtle. If I didn't tow him hard, we'd never get into port." I walked most of the way over the steep grades, whereupon my guide, every inch a sailor, became my friend. Arriving at the summit of the island, I met Mr. Shank, the farmer from Canada, and his sister, living very cosily in a house among the rocks, as snug as cronies and as safe. He showed me over the farm, taking me through a tunnel which led from one field to the other, divided by an inaccessible spur of mountain. Mr. Shank said that he had lost many cows and bullocks, as well as sheep, from breakneck over the steep cliffs and precipices. One cow, he said, would sometimes hook another right over a precipice to destruction, and go on feeding unconcernedly. It seemed that the animals on the island farm, like mankind in the wide world, found it all too small. On the 26th of April, while I was ashore, rollers came in which rendered launching a boat impossible. However, the sloop being securely moored to a buoy in deep water outside of all breakers, she was safe, while I, in the best of quarters, listened to well-told stories among the officers of the stone frigate. On the evening of the 29th, the sea having gone down, I went on board and made preparations to start again on my voyage early next day, the boatswain of the island and his crew giving me a hearty handshake as I embarked at the jetty. For reasons of scientific interest, I invited in mid-ocean the most thorough investigation concerning the crew list of the Spray. Very few had challenged it, and perhaps few ever will do so henceforth. But for the benefit of the few that may, I wished to clench beyond doubt the fact that it was not at all necessary in the expedition of a sloop around the world to have more than one man for the crew, all told, and that the Spray sailed with only one person on board. And so, by appointment, Lieutenant Eagles, the executive officer, in the morning, just as I was ready to sail, fumigated the sloop, rendering it impossible for a person to live concealed below, and proving that only one person was on board when she arrived. A certificate to this effect, besides the official documents from many consulates, health offices, and custom houses, will seem to many superfluous, but this story of the voyage may find its way into hands unfamiliar with the business of these offices, and of their ways of seeing that a vessel's papers, and above all her bills of health, are in order. The lieutenant's certificate being made out, the Spray, nothing loath, now filled away clear of the sea-beaten rocks, and the trade winds, comfortably cool and bracing, sent her flying along on her course. On May 8, 1898, she crossed the track homeward bound that she had made on October 2, 1895, on the voyage out. She passed Fernando de Noronha at night, going some miles south of it, and so I did not see the island. I felt a contentment in knowing that the Spray had encircled the globe, and even as an adventure alone, I was in no way discouraged as to its utility, and said to myself, let what will happen, the voyage is now on record. A period was made. End of chapter 19. Read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. Chapter 20 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 20, consisting of In the Favouring Current off Cape St. Roque, Brazil, All at Sea regarding the Spanish-American War, An exchange of signals with the battleship Oregon, Off De Freitas prison on Devil's Island, Reappearance to the spray of the North Star, The Light on Trinidad, A charming introduction to Grenada, Talks to friendly auditors. On May 10 there was a great change in the condition of the sea. There could be no doubt of my longitude now, if any had before existed in my mind. Strange and long-forgotten current ripples pattered against the sloop's sides in grateful music. The tune arrested the ear, and I sat quietly listening to it while the spray kept on her course. By those current ripples I was assured that she was now off St. Roque, and had struck the current which sweeps round the cape. The trade winds, we old sailors say, produce this current, which in its course for this point forward is governed by the coastline of Brazil, Guiana, Venezuela, and, as some would say, by the Monroe Doctrine. The trades had been blowing fresh for some time, and the current, now at its height, amounted to 40 miles a day. This, added to the sloop's run by the log, made the handsome day's work of 180 miles on several consecutive days. I saw nothing of the coast of Brazil, though I was not many leagues off, and was always in the Brazil current. I did not know that war with Spain had been declared, and that I might be liable right there to meet the enemy and be captured. Many had told me at Cape Town that, in their opinion, war was inevitable, and they said, "The Spaniard will get you, the Spaniard will get you." To all this I could only say that even so he would not get much. Even in the fever heat over the disaster to the Maine, I did not think there would be war, but I am no politician. Indeed, I had hardly given the matter a serious thought when, on the 14th of May, just north of the equator and near the longitude of the river Amazon, I first saw a mast with the stars and stripes floating from it, rising astern, as if poked up out of the sea, and then rapidly appearing on the horizon, like a citadel, the Oregon. As she came near, I saw that the great ship was flying the signals C.B.T., which read, "Are there any men of war about?" Right under these flags, and larger than the spray's mainsail, so it appeared, was the yellowest Spanish flag I ever saw. It gave me a nightmare some time after, when I reflected on it in my dreams. I did not make out the Oregon signals till she passed ahead, where I could read them better, for she was 2 miles away, and I had no binoculars. When I had read her flags, I hoisted the signal "No," for I had not seen any Spanish men of war. I had not been looking for any. My final signal, "Let us keep together for mutual protection," Captain Clark did not seem to regard as necessary. Perhaps my small flags were not made out. Anyhow, the Oregon steamed on with a rush, looking for Spanish men of war, as I learned afterwards. The Oregon's great flag was dipped beautifully 3 times to the Spray's lowered flag as she passed on. Both had crossed the line only a few hours before. I pondered long that night over the probability of a war risk now coming upon the Spray after she had cleared all, or nearly all, the dangers of the sea. But finally a strong hope mastered my fears. On the 17th of May, the Spray, coming out of a storm at daylight, made Devil's Island, 2 points on the lee bow, not far off. The wind was still blowing a stiff breeze on shore. I could clearly see the dark grey buildings on the island as the sloop brought it abeam. No flag or sign of life was seen on the dreary place. Later in the day, a French barque on the port tack making for Cayenne, hove in sight close-hauled on the wind. She was falling to leeward fast. The Spray was also close-hauled, and was lugging on sail to secure an offing on the starboard tack, a heavy swell in the night having thrown her too near the shore, and now I considered the matter of supplicating a change of wind. I had already enjoyed my share of favouring breezes over the great oceans, and I asked myself if it would be right to have the wind turned now all into my sails while the Frenchman was bound the other way. A head current which he stemmed, together with a scant wind, was bad enough for him, and so I could only say in my heart, Lord, let matters stand as they are, but do not help the Frenchman any more just now, for what would suit him would well ruin me. I remembered that when a lad I heard a captain often say in meeting that in answer to a prayer of his own the wind changed from southeast to northwest entirely to his satisfaction. He was a good man, but did this glorify the architect, the ruler of the winds and the waves? Moreover, it was not a trade wind, as I remember it, that changed for him, but one of the variables, which will change when you ask it, if you ask long enough. Again, this man's brother, maybe, was not bound the opposite way, well content with a fair wind himself, which made all the difference in the world. Footnote: the Bishop of Melbourne, commend me to his teachings, refused to set aside a day of prayer for rain, recommending his people to husband water when the rainy season was on. In like manner, a navigator husbands the wind, keeping a weather gauge where practicable. On May 18, 1898, is written large in the Spray's logbook, "Tonight, in latitude 7 degrees 13 minutes north, for the first time in nearly 3 years, I see the North Star." The Spray on the day following logged 147 miles. To this I add 35 miles for current sweeping her onward. On the 20th of May, about sunset, the island of Tobago, off the Orinoco, came into view, bearing west by north, distant 22 miles. The Spray was drawing rapidly towards her home destination. Later at night, while running free along the coast of Tobago, the wind still blowing fresh, I was startled by the sudden flash of breakers on the port bow and not far off. I luffed instantly offshore, and then tacked, heading in for the island. Finding myself shortly after close in with the land, I tacked again offshore, but without much altering the bearing of the danger. Sail whichever way I would, it seemed clear that if the sloop weathered the rocks at all, it would be a close shave, and I watched with anxiety while beating against the current, always losing ground. So the matter stood hour after hour, while I watched the flashes of light thrown up as regularly as the beats of the long ocean swells, and always they seemed just a little nearer. It was evidently a coral reef, of this I had not the slightest doubt, and a bad reef at that. Worse still, there might be other reefs ahead forming a bight into which the current would sweep me, and where I should be hemmed in and finally wrecked. I had not sailed these waters since a lad, and lamented the day I had allowed on board the goat that ate my chart. I taxed my memory of sea lore, of wrecks on sunken reefs, and of pirates harboured among coral reefs where other ships might not come, but nothing that I could think of applied to the island of Tobago, save the one wreck of Robinson Crusoe's ship in the fiction, and that gave me little information about reefs. I remembered only that in Crusoe's case he kept his powder dry. "But there she booms again," I cried, "and how close the flash is now! Almost aboard was that last breaker. But you'll go by, Spray, old girl. 'Tis abeam now. One surge more, and oh, one more like that will clear your ribs and keel." And I slapped her on the transom, proud of her last noble effort to leap clear of the danger, when a wave greater than the rest threw her higher than before, and behold, from the crest of it was revealed at once all there was of the reef. I fell back in a coil of rope, speechless and amazed, not distressed, but rejoiced. Aladdin's lamp, my fisherman's own lantern! It was the great revolving light on the island of Trinidad, 30 miles away, throwing flashes over the waves which had deceived me. The orb of the light was now dipping on the horizon, and how glorious was the sight of it! But, dear Father Neptune, as I live, after a long life at sea and much among corals, I would have made a solemn declaration to that reef. Through all the rest of the night I saw imaginary reefs, and not knowing what moment the sloop might fetch up on a real one, I tacked off and on till daylight, as nearly as possible in the same track. All for the want of a chart. I could have nailed the St. Helena's goat's pelt to the deck. My course was now for Grenada, to which I carried letters from Mauritius. About midnight on the 22nd of May I arrived at the island, and cast anchor in the roads off the town of St. George, entering the inner harbour at daylight on the morning of the 23rd, which made 42 days' sailing from the Cape of Good Hope. It was a good run, and I doffed my cap again to the pilot of the Pinta. Lady Bruce, in a note to the Spray at Point Louis, said Grenada was a lovely island, and she wished the sloop might call there on the voyage home. When the Spray arrived, I found that she had been fully expected. How so? I asked. Oh, we heard that you were at Mauritius, they said, and from Mauritius, after meeting Sir Charles Bruce, our old governor, we knew you would come to Grenada. This was a charming introduction, and it brought me in contact with people worth knowing. The Spray sailed from Grenada on the 28th of May, and coasted along under the lee of the Antilles, arriving at the island of Dominica on the 30th, where, for the want of knowing better, I cast anchor at the quarantine ground, for I was still without a chart of the islands, not having been able to get one even at Grenada. Here I not only met with further disappointment in the matter, but was threatened with a fine for the mistake I made in the anchorage. There were no ships either at the quarantine or at the commercial roads, and I could not see that it made much difference where I anchored. But a negro chap, a sort of deputy harbour master, coming along, thought it did, and he ordered me to shift to the other anchorage, which, in truth, I had already investigated and did not like because of the heavier roll there from the sea. And so, instead of springing to the sails at once to shift, I said I would leave outright as soon as I could procure a chart, which I begged he would send and get for me. "But I say you must move before you get anything at all," he insisted, and raising his voice so that all the people along shore could hear him, he added, "And just now." Then he flew into a towering passion, when they on shore snickered to see the crew of the Spray sitting calmly by the bulwark instead of hoisting sail. "I tell you dis am quarantine," he shouted, very much louder than before. "That's all right, General," I replied. "I want to be quarantined anyhow." "That's right, boss," someone on the beach shouted. "That's right, you'll get quarantined," while others shouted to the deputy to "make the white trash move along out of that." They were about equally divided on the island, for and against me. The man who had made so much fuss over the matter gave it up when he found that I wished to be quarantined, and sent for an all-important half-white, who soon came alongside, starched from clew to earring. He stood in the boat as straight up and down as a fathom of pump water, a marvel of importance. "Charts!" cried I, as soon as his shirt collar appeared over the sloop's rail. "Have you any charts?" "No, sir," he replied with much stiffened dignity. "No, sir, charts doesn't grow on this island." Not doubting the information, I tripped anchor immediately, as I had intended to do from the first, and made all sail for St. John, Antigua, where I arrived on the 1st of June, having sailed with great caution in mid-channel all the way. The Spray, always in good company, now fell in with the port officer's steam launch at the harbour entrance, having on board Sir Francis Fleming, governor of the Leeward Islands, who, to the delight of all hands, gave the officer in charge instructions to tow my ship into port. On the following day, His Excellency and Lady Fleming, along with Captain Burr, R.N., paid me a visit. The courthouse was tendered free to me at Antigua, as was done also at Grenada, and at each place a highly intelligent audience filled the hall to listen to a talk about the seas the Spray had crossed and the countries she had visited. End of chapter 20. Read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. Chapter 21 of Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Chapter 21, consisting of Clearing for Home, In the Calm Belt, A Sea Covered with Sargasso, The Jibstay Parts in a Gale, Welcomed by a Tornado off Fire Island, A Change of Plan, Arrival at Newport, End of a Cruise of over 46,000 miles, The Spray again at Fairhaven. On the 4th of June, 1898, the Spray cleared from the United States Consulate, and her licence to sail single-handed, even round the world, was returned to her for the last time. The United States Consul, Mr. Hunt, before handing the papers to me, wrote on it, as General Roberts had done at Cape Town, a short commentary on the voyage. The document, by regular course, is now lodged in the Treasury Department at Washington, D.C. On June 5, 1898, the Spray sailed for a home port, heading first direct to Cape Hatteras. On the 8th of June she passed under the sun from south to north. The sun's declination on that day was 22 degrees 54 minutes, and the latitude of the Spray was the same just before noon. Many think it is excessively hot right under the sun. It is not necessarily so. As a matter of fact, the thermometer stands at a bearable point whenever there is a breeze and a ripple on the sea, even exactly under the sun. It is often hotter in cities and on sandy shores in higher latitudes. The Spray was booming joyously along for home now, making her usual good time, when of a sudden she struck the horse latitudes, and her sail flapped limp in a calm. I had almost forgotten this calm belt, or had come to regard it as a myth. I now found it real, however, and difficult to cross. This was as it should have been, for, after all the dangers of the sea, the dust storm on the coast of Africa, the rain of blood in Australia, and the war risk when nearing home, a natural experience would have been missing had the calm of the horse latitudes been left out. Anyhow, a philosophical turn of thought now was not amiss, else one's patience would have given out almost at the harbour entrance. The term of her probation was 8 days. Evening after evening during this time I read by the light of a candle on deck. There was no wind at all, and the sea became smooth and monotonous. For 3 days I saw a fully rigged ship on the horizon, also becalmed. Sargasso scattered over the sea in bunches or trailed curiously along down the wind in narrow lanes, now gathered together in great fields, strange sea animals, little and big, swimming in and out, the most curious among them being a tiny seahorse, which I captured and brought home preserved in a bottle. But on the 18th of June a gale began to blow from the southwest, and the Sargasso was dispersed again in windrows and lanes. On this day there was soon wind enough, and to spare. The same might have been said of the sea. The Spray was in the midst of the turbulent Gulf Stream itself. She was jumping like a porpoise over the uneasy waves. As if to make up for lost time, she seemed to touch only the high places, under a sudden shock and strain her rigging began to give out. First the mainstay strap was carried away, then the peak-halyard block broke from the gaff. It was time to reef and refit, and so when all hands came on deck, I went about doing that. The 19th of June was fine, but on the morning of the 20th another gale was blowing, accompanied by cross seas that tumbled about and shook things up with great confusion. Just as I was thinking about taking in sail, the jibstay broke at the masthead and fell jib and all into the sea. It gave me the strangest sensation to see the bellying sail fall, and where it had been, suddenly to see only space. However, I was in the bows with presence of mind to gather it in on the first wave that rolled up, before it was torn or trailed under the sloop's bottom. I found by the amount of work done in 3 minutes or less time that I had by no means grown stiff-jointed on the voyage. Anyhow, scurvy had not set in. And now, being within a few degrees of home, I might complete the voyage, I thought, without the aid of a doctor. Yes, my health was still good, and I could skip about the decks in lively manner, but could I climb? The great King Neptune tested me severely at this time, for the stay being gone, the mast itself switched about like a reed, and was not easy to climb. But a gun-tackle purchase was got up, and the stay set taut from the masthead, for I had spare blocks and rope on board with which to rig it, and the jib, with a reef in it, was soon pulling again like a sodger for home. Had the Spray's mast not been well stepped, however, it would have been John Walker when the stay broke. Good work in the building of my vessel stood me always in good stead. On the 23rd of June, I was at last tired of baffling squalls and fretful cobble seas. I had not seen a vessel for days and days, where I had expected the company of at least a schooner now and then. As to the whistling of the wind through the rigging, and the slopping of the seas against the sloop's sides, that was well enough in its way, and we could not have got on without it, the Spray and I. But there was so much of it now, and it lasted so long. At noon on that day, a winterish storm was upon us from the northwest. In the Gulf Stream, thus late in June, hailstones were pelting the Spray, and lightning was pouring down from the clouds, not in flashes alone, but in almost continuous streams. By slants, however, day and night, I worked the sloop in towards the coast, where on the 25th of June, off Fire Island, she fell into the tornado which, an hour earlier, had swept over New York City with lightning that wrecked buildings and sent trees flying about in splinters. Even ships at docks had parted their moorings and smashed into other ships, doing great damage. It was the climax storm of the voyage, but I saw the unmistakable character of it in time to have all snug aboard and receive it under bare poles. Even so, the sloop shivered when it struck her, and she heeled over unwillingly on her beam ends, but rounding to with a sea anchor ahead, she righted and faced out the storm. In the midst of the gale I could do no more than look on, for what is a man in a storm like this? I had seen one electric storm on the voyage, off the coast of Madagascar, but it was unlike this one. Here the lightning kept on longer, and thunderbolts fell in the sea all about. Up to this time I was bound for New York, but when all was over I rose, made sail, and hove the sloop round from starboard to port tack, to make for a quiet harbour to think the matter over. And so, under short sail, she reached in for the coast of Long Island, while I sat thinking and watching the lights of coasting vessels which now began to appear in sight. Reflections of the voyage, so nearly finished, stole in upon me now. Many tunes I had hummed again and again came back once more. I found myself repeating fragments of a hymn often sung by a dear Christian woman of Fairhaven when I was rebuilding the Spray. I was to hear once more, and only once, in profound solemnity, the metaphorical hymn, "By waves and wind I'm tossed and driven," and again, "But still my little ship outbraves the blustering winds and stormy waves." After this storm, I saw the pilot of the Pinta no more. The experiences of the voyage of the Spray, reaching over 3 years, had been to me like reading a book, and one that was more and more interesting as I turned the pages, till I had come now to the last page of all, and the one more interesting than any of the rest. When daylight came, I saw that the sea had changed colour from dark green to light. I threw the lead and got soundings in 13 fathoms. I made the land soon after, some miles east of Fire Island, and sailing thence before a pleasant breeze along the coast, made for Newport. The weather after the furious gale was remarkably fine. The Spray rounded Montauk Point early in the afternoon. Point Judith was abeam at dark. She fetched in at Beaver Tail next. Sailing on, she had one more danger to pass. Newport Harbour was mined. The Spray hugged the rocks along where neither friend nor foe could come if drawing much water, and where she would not disturb the guardship in the channel. It was close work, but it was safe enough so long as she hugged the rocks close and not the mines. Flitting by a low point abreast of the guardship, the dear old Dexter, which I knew well, someone on board of her sang out, "There goes a craft!" I threw up a light at once and heard the hail, "Spray, ahoy!" It was the voice of a friend, and I knew that a friend would not fire on the Spray. I eased off the main sheet now, and the Spray swung off for the beacon lights of the inner harbour. At last she reached port in safety, and there, at 1 a.m. on June 27, 1898, cast anchor, after the cruise of more than 46,000 miles round the world, during an absence of 3 years and 2 months, with 2 days over for coming up. Was the crew well? Was I not? I had profited in many ways by the voyage. I had even gained flesh, and actually weighed 1 pound more than when I sailed from Boston. As for aging, why, the dial of my life was turned back till my friends all said, "Slocum is young again." And so I was, at least 10 years younger than the day I felled the first tree for the construction of the Spray. My ship was also in better condition than when she sailed from Boston on her long voyage. She was still as sound as a nut and as tight as the best ship afloat. She did not leak a drop, not one drop. The pump, which had been little used before reaching Australia, had not been rigged since that at all. The first name on the Spray's visitors' book in the home port was written by the one who always said, "The Spray will come back." The Spray was not quite satisfied till I sailed her around to her birthplace, Fairhaven, Massachusetts, further along. I had myself a desire to return to the place of the very beginning whence I had, as I have said, renewed my age. So on July 3, with a fair wind, she waltzed beautifully round the coast and up the Acushnet River to Fairhaven, where I secured her to the cedar spile driven in the bank to hold her when she was launched. I could bring her no nearer home. If the Spray discovered no continents on her voyage, it may be that there were no continents left to be discovered. She did not seek new worlds, or sail to powwow about the dangers of the sea. The sea has been much maligned. To find one's way to lands already discovered is a good thing, and the Spray made the discovery that even the worst sea is not so terrible to a well-appointed ship. No king, no country, no treasury at all was taxed for the voyage of the Spray, and she accomplished all that she undertook to do. To succeed, however, in anything at all, one should go understandingly about his work, and be prepared for every emergency. I see, as I look back over my own small achievement, a kit of not too elaborate carpenter's tools, a tin clock, and some carpet tacks, not a great many, to facilitate the enterprise as already mentioned in the story. But above all to be taken into account were some years of schooling, where I studied with diligence Neptune's laws, and these laws I tried to obey when I sailed overseas. it was worth the while. And now, without having wearied my friends, I hope, with detailed scientific accounts, theories, or deductions, I will only say that I have endeavoured to tell just the story of the adventure itself. This, in my own poor way, having been done, I now moor ship, weather bit cables, and leave the sloop Spray, for the present, safe in port. End of chapter 21. Read by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. Appendix to Sailing Alone Around the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Chant. Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Appendix. Consisting of lines and sail plan of the Spray, her pedigree as known so far, the lines of the Spray, her self-steering qualities, sail plan and steering gear, an unprecedented feat, a final word of cheer to would-be navigators. From a feeling of diffidence towards sailors of great experience, I refrained in the preceding chapters, as prepared for serial publication in the Century magazine, from entering fully into the details of the Spray's build, and of the primitive methods employed to sail her. Having had no sailing experience at all, I had no means of knowing that the trim vessels seen in our harbours and near the land could not all do as much, or even more, than the Spray, sailing, for example, on a course with the helm lashed. I was unaware that no other vessel had sailed in this manner round the globe, but would have been loath to say that another could not do it, or that many men had not sailed vessels of a certain rig in that manner as far as they wished to go. I was greatly amused, therefore, by the flat assertions of an expert that it could not be done. The Spray, as I sailed her, was entirely a new boat, built over from a sloop which bore the same name, and which tradition said had first served as an oysterman about 100 years ago on the coast of Delaware. There was no record in the custom house of where she was built. She was once owned at Noank, Connecticut, afterward in New Bedford, and when Captain Eben Pierce presented her to me at the end of her natural life, she stood, as I have already described, propped up in a field at Fairhaven. Her lines were supposed to be those of a North Sea fisherman. In rebuilding timber by timber and plank by plank, I added to her freeboard 12 inches amidships, 18 inches forward, and 14 inches aft, thereby increasing her shear and making her, as I thought, a better deep-water ship. I will not repeat the history of the rebuilding of the Spray, which I have detailed in my first chapter, except to say that, when finished, her dimensions were 36 feet 9 inches overall, 14 feet 2 inches wide, and 4 feet 2 inches deep in the hold, her tonnage being 9 tons net, and 12 71/100 tons gross. I gladly reproduce the lines of the Spray, with such hints as my really limited fore and aft sailing will allow, my seafaring life having been spent mostly in barks and ships. No pains have been spared to give them accuracy. The Spray was taken from New York to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and under the supervision of the Park City Yacht Club was hauled out of water and very carefully measured in every way to secure a satisfactory result. Captain Robbins produced the model. Our young yachtsman, pleasuring in the lilies of the sea, very naturally will not think favourably of my craft. They have a right to their opinion, while I stick to mine. They will take exception to her short ends, the advantage of these being most apparent in a heavy sea. Some things about the Spray's deck might be fashioned differently without materially affecting the vessel. I know of no good reason why, for a party boat, a cabin trunk might not be built amidships, instead of far aft, like the one on her, which leaves a very narrow space between the wheel and the line of the companionway. Some even say that I might have improved the shape of her stern. I do not know about that. The water leaves her run sharp after bearing her to the last inch, and no suction is formed by undue cutaway. Smooth water sailors say, where is her overhang? They never cross the Gulf Stream in a nor'easter, and they do not know what is best in all weathers. For your life build no fantail overhang on a craft going offshore. As a sailor judges his prospective ship by a blow of the eye, when he takes interest enough to look her over at all, so I judged the Spray, and I was not deceived. In a sloop rig, the Spray made that part of her voyage reaching from Boston through the Strait of Magellan, during which she experienced the greatest variety of weather conditions. The yawl rig then adopted was an improvement only in that it reduced the size of a rather heavy mainsail and slightly improved her steering qualities on the wind. When the wind was aft, the jigger was not in use. Invariably it was then furled. With her boom broad off, and with the wind 2 points on the quarter, the Spray sailed her truest course. It never took long to find the amount of helm or angle of rudder required to hold her on her course, and when that was found, I lashed the wheel with it at that angle. The mainsail then drove her, and the main jib with its sheet bowsed flat amidships, or a little to one side or the other, added greatly to the steadying power. Then, if the wind was even strong or squally, I would sometimes set a flying jib also, on a pole rigged out on the bowsprit, with the sheets hauled flat amidships, which was a safe thing to do, even in a gale of wind. A stout downhaul on the gaff was a necessity, because without it the mainsail might not have come down when I wished to lower it in a breeze. The amount of helm required varied according to the amount of wind and its direction. These points are quickly gathered from practice. Briefly, I have to say that when close hauled in a light wind under all sail, she required little or no weather helm. As the wind increased, I would go on deck, if below, and turn the wheel up a spoke, more or less, relash it, or as sailors say, put it in a becket, and then leave it as before. To answer the questions that might be asked to meet every contingency would be a pleasure, but it would overburden my book. I can only say here that much comes to one in practice, and that with such as love sailing, mother wit is the best teacher after experience. Labour-saving appliances? There were none. The sails were hoisted by hand, the halyards were rove through ordinary ship's blocks with common patent rollers. Of course, the sheets were all belayed aft. The windlass used was in the shape of a winch or crab, I think it is called. I had 3 anchors, weighing 40 pounds, 100 pounds, and 180 pounds respectively. The windlass and the 40-pound anchor, and the fiddlehead or carving on the end of the cutwater, belonged to the original Spray. The ballast, concrete cement, was staunchened down securely. There was no iron or lead or other weight on the keel. If I took measurements by rule, I did not set them down, and after sailing even the longest voyage in her, I could not tell offhand the length of her mast, boom, or gaff. I did not know the centre of effort in her sails, except as it hit me in practice at sea, nor did I care a rope yarn about it. Mathematical calculations, however, are all right in a good boat, and the Spray could have stood them. She was easily balanced and easily kept in trim. Some of the oldest and ablest shipmasters have asked how it was possible for her to hold a true course before the wind, which is just what the Spray did for weeks together. One of these gentlemen, a highly esteemed shipmaster and friend, testified as government expert in a famous murder trial in Boston not long since, that a ship would not hold her course long enough for the steersman to leave the helm to cut the captain's throat. Ordinarily, it would be so. One might say that with a square-rigged ship it would always be so. But the Spray, at the moment of the tragedy in question, was sailing around the globe with no one at the helm, except at intervals more or less rare. However, I may say here that this would have had no bearing on the murder case in Boston. In all probability, justice laid her hand on the true rogue. In other words, in the case of a model and rig similar to that of the tragedy ship, I should myself testify as the nautical experts at the trial. But see the run the Spray made from Thursday Island to the Keeling Cocos Island, 2,700 miles distant, in 23 days, with no one at the helm at that time, save for about an hour, from land to land. No other ship in the history of the world ever performed, under similar circumstances, the feat on so long and continuous a voyage. It was, however, a delightful midsummer sail. No one can know the pleasure of sailing free over the great oceans, save those who have had the experience. It is not necessary, in order to realize the utmost enjoyment of going around the globe, to sail alone. Yet for once, and the first time, there was a great deal of fun in it. My friend, the government expert, and saltiest of salt sea captains, standing only yesterday on the deck of the Spray, was convinced of her famous qualities, and he spoke enthusiastically of selling his farm on Cape Cod and putting to sea again. To young men contemplating a voyage, I would say, go. The tales of rough usage are for the most part exaggerations, as also are the stories of sea danger. I had a fair schooling in the so-called hard ships on the hard Western Ocean, and in the years there I do not remember having once been called out of my name. Such recollections have endeared the sea to me. I owe it further to the officers of all the ships I ever sailed in, as boy and man, to say that not one ever lifted so much as a finger to me. I did not live among angels, but among men who could be roused. My wish was, though, to please the officers of my ship wherever I was, and so I got on. Dangers there are, to be sure, on the sea as well as on the land, but the intelligence and skill God gives to man reduce these to a minimum. And here comes in again the skilfully modelled ship, worthy to sail the seas. To face the elements is, to be sure, no light matter when the sea is in its grandest mood. You must then know the sea, and know that you know it, and not forget that it was made to be sailed over. I have given in the plans of the Spray the dimensions of such a ship as I should call seaworthy in all conditions of weather and on all seas. It is only right to say, though, that to ensure a reasonable measure of success, experience should sail with the ship. But in order to be a successful navigator or sailor, it is not necessary to hang a tar bucket round one's neck. On the other hand, much thought concerning the brass buttons one should wear adds nothing to the safety of the ship. I may some day see reason to modify the model of the dear old Spray, but out of my limited experience, I strongly recommend her wholesome lines over those of pleasure flyers for safety. Practice in a craft such as the Spray will teach young sailors and fit them for the more important vessels. I myself learned more seamanship, I think, on the Spray than on any other ship I ever sailed. And as for patience, the greatest of all the virtues, even while sailing through the reaches of the Strait of Magellan, between the bluff mainland and dismal Fuego, where through intricate sailing I was obliged to steer, I learned to sit by the wheel, content to make 10 miles a day beating against the tide, and when a month at that was all lost, I could find some old tune to hum while I worked the route all over again, beating as before. Nor did 30 hours at the wheel, in storm, overtax my human endurance, and to clap a hand to an oar and pull into or out of port in a calm was no strange experience for the crew of the Spray. The days passed happily with me, wherever my ship sailed. End of appendix, and end of Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. Recording by Alan Chant in Tunbridge, Kent, England, during the early summer of 2007. www.sevenoaksprep.kent.sch.uk. The recordings of herring gulls used in these readings are in the public domain. They may be found at www.pdsounds.org. The gulls were recorded by Tony Phillips near where Joshua Slocum built the Spray, only 100 years later.